A luxurious train, the Silver Crescent Express, speeds through a snowy night, its first-class passengers hiding secrets as dark as the storm outside. When ruthless industrialist Victor Langston is found stabbed in his locked compartment, Hercule Poirot must unravel a web of lies, motives, and vengeance. From a nervous secretary to a glamorous actress, a vengeful colonel to a mysterious diplomat, every passenger is a suspect. As the train stalls in a snowdrift, Poirot's little grey cells race to uncover a shocking truth, a conspiracy of justice where everyone had a hand in the crime. Will Poirot's brilliant deduction reveal the killer or protect their secret forever? Chapter 1. The journey begins. The Silver Crescent Express gleamed under the pale Parisian moonlight, its polished carriages reflecting the glow of gas lamps lining the platform at Gare de l'Est. The air was crisp, laced with the faint scent of coal smoke and the anticipation of departure. Hercule Poirot adjusted his immaculate overcoat, his gloved fingers brushing the brim of his hat as he surveyed the bustling scene. Porters darted about, their breath visible in the November chill, hefting trunks and valises into the trains. Under carriage, passengers, wrapped in furs and tailored suits, exchanged farewells or hurried aboard, their voices a medley of French, English, and other tongues that hinted at the cosmopolitan nature of this journey. Poirot's moustache twitched slightly as he observed the crowd. He had not intended to travel on the Silver Crescent Express, a luxurious train renowned for its opulence and its route through the heart of Europe, from Paris to Vienna. His plans had been altered by a telegram from an old friend, Monsieur Gustave Renaud, a director of the Compagnie Internationale des Whodunits, who had insisted Poirot join him for a matter of utmost delicacy. The details were vague, but Renaud's tone suggested intrigue, and Poirot's curiosity, ever the servant of his little grey cells, had been piqued. "Bonsoir, Monsieur Poirot," called a familiar voice. Pierre Dubois, the chief conductor of the Silver Crescent Express, approached with a deferential bow. His uniform was pristine, the brass buttons gleaming, his cap set at a precise angle. "It is an honor to have you aboard. Your compartment, number 7 in the first-class carriage, is prepared." "May I escort you?" "Merci," Pierre Poirot replied, his voice smooth and measured. "But I prefer to observe the passengers a moment longer. One learns much from the small details. The way a man carries his suitcase, the glance a lady casts over her shoulder. Tell me, how is the company on this journey?" Pierre's smile faltered, a flicker of unease crossing his face before he recovered. "Most distinguished, monsieur. We have a full complement in first-class 8 passengers, including yourself. A mix of wealth, influence, and, well, character." "Character, you say?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "That is a polite way to suggest complications, Nan." Pierre chuckled nervously. "You see through me, monsieur. Shall I have your bags brought aboard?" "Oui, si vous plaît." Poirot handed over his small leather valise, keeping only his walking stick, its silver handle cool against his palm. As Pierre signaled a porter, Poirot turned his attention to the passengers ascending the steps to the first-class carriage. First came Victor Langston, a British industrialist whose name was synonymous with steel and ambition. His broad shoulders strained against a tailored overcoat, and his face, ruddy from years of cigars and brandy, was set in a scowl as he barked orders at a porter. Trailing him was Clara Evans, his secretary, a slight woman in her 30s with mousy brown hair and spectacles that seemed to magnify her anxious eyes. She clutched a leather portfolio, her fingers trembling slightly as she glanced at Langston. Next was Madame Isabelle Dubois, the celebrated actress whose face adorned Parisian theatre posters. Her fur stole swept the platform, and her auburn hair caught the lamplight as she paused to wave at an imaginary audience. Her laugh was musical, but Poirot noted a hardness in her eyes, a calculation beneath the charm. Colonel Henry Warwick followed, his military bearing unmistakable despite his civilian attire. His moustache, grey and bristling, rivaled Poirot's own, though it lacked the same meticulous curl. He carried a small case, his movements precise, as if still marching to a drumbeat. His eyes scanned the platform with the wariness of a man accustomed to danger. Then came Emily Thornton, a young heiress whose delicate features and golden curls drew admiring glances. She leaned on the arm of her fiancé, Julian Blake, a handsome man with a roguish smile and a tailored suit that spoke of wealth, if not taste. Their laughter was bright, but Poirot sensed a performative quality, as if they were playing roles. For the benefit of onlookers, Miss Agnes Holt, a governess, boarded next, her plain grey dress and severe bun making her nearly invisible among the glittering crowd. Her eyes, however, were sharp, darting to each passenger as if cataloguing them. Finally, Count Vladimir Orloff, a foreign diplomat with a hawkish face and a heavy fur coat, ascended with an air of aloofness, his gloved hand resting on an ebony cane. Poirot followed them aboard, his steps measured, his mind already sorting the impressions. The first-class carriage was a marvel of Art Deco elegance, polished mahogany panels, plush velvet seats, and crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow. Each compartment was a private haven, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window framed by silk curtains. Poirot's compartment, number 7, was situated near the centre of the carriage, offering a strategic view of the corridor. As the train whistle pierced the night, signalling departure, Poirot settled into his compartment. He unpacked his valise with care, arranging his toiletries in precise order: a silver-backed brush, a bottle of lavender water, a small tin of moustache wax. He adjusted his tie in the mirror, ensuring the knot was symmetrical, then stepped into the corridor to join the other passengers for dinner. The dining car was a vision of opulence, its tables set with crisp linens, silver cutlery, and crystal glasses that sparkled under the chandeliers. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their music mingling with the clink of glasses and the murmur of conversation. Poirot took his seat at a table for one, positioned to observe the entire car. Pierre hovered nearby, directing waiters. With the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra, Victor Langston dominated his table, his voice booming as he recounted a business triumph to Clara, who nodded dutifully while scribbling notes. Madame Dubois held court at another table, her laughter drawing smiles from the waiters and envious glances from Emily Thornton. Colonel Warwick sat alone, his fork moving with military precision, his eyes fixed on Langston with a barely concealed scowl. Emily and Julian shared a table, their hands entwined, though Poirot noticed Julian's gaze lingering on Madame Dubois. Miss Holt sat quietly, her meal untouched, her eyes flitting between the other passengers. Count Orlov was absent, having requested his meal in his compartment. Poirot sipped his consomme, savouring the delicate flavour while cataloguing the interactions. Langston's brashness seemed to irritate Warwick, who muttered something under his breath. Clara's hands shook as she poured Langston's wine, spilling a drop that earned her a sharp rebuke. Madame Dubois leaned toward Julian, her voice low and teasing, causing Emily to grip her napkin tightly. Miss Holt's gaze lingered on Langston, her expression unreadable but intense. As the meal progressed, The train gathered speed, its wheels clattering rhythmically over the tracks. Outside, the Parisian suburbs gave way to dark fields, the stars obscured by gathering clouds. Poirot noted the weather with interest. A storm was forecast, and the Silver Crescent Express was known for its punctuality, but nature was an unpredictable adversary. After deserter, flawless tart, Tatin Poirot lingered over his coffee, listening to the snippets of conversation that floated through the car. Langston was discussing a recent acquisition, a steelworks in Belgium, with a tone that suggested ruthlessness. "Some sacrifices are necessary," he said, his eyes cold. "The weak must make way for progress." Clara flinched at the words, her pen pausing. Colonel Warwick's fork clattered against his plate, and he excused himself abruptly, striding toward the smoking lounge. Madame Dubois raised an eyebrow, her lips curling in amusement. "Such passion," she murmured to Julian, who laughed too loudly. Poirot returned to his compartment, his mind buzzing. He sat at the small writing desk, jotting notes in his precise handwriting. Langston arrogant, possibly enemies. Clara nervous, perhaps hiding something. Warwick resentful, military. Precision, Dubois calculating, manipulative. Thornton and Blake to perfect, a facade. Holt observant, secretive. Olive absent, mysterious. He closed his notebook and prepared for bed, slipping into silk pajamas and arranging his pillows with care. The train rocked gently, its rhythm soothing, but Poirot's mind remained alert. He sensed among the passengers threads of tension that might weave into something dangerous. As he extinguished the lamp, plunging the compartment into darkness, he heard a faint sound, soft thud, followed by a muffled voice in the corridor. He paused, listening, but the sound did not repeat. The Silver Crescent Express sped through. The night, its passengers cocooned in luxury, unaware that fate was about to derail their journey. Poirot, ever vigilant, drifted into a light sleep, his little grey cells poised for the challenge that lay ahead. The train's whistle sounded again, a lonely cry in the darkness, as snow began to fall outside, blanketing the world in silence. The dining car was still lively when Poirot returned the next morning. The passengers gathered for breakfast. The storm had intensified, and the train's pace had slowed, the windows now framed with frost. Pierre moved among the tables, his smile strained as he assured passengers that the delay was temporary. "A snowdrift on the tracks," he explained. "The crew is working to clear it." Langston was already complaining, his voice carrying over the clatter of cutlery. "This is unacceptable," he snapped, jabbing a finger at Pierre. "I have meetings in Vienna. Do you know who I am?" Pierre bowed apologetically, but Poirot noted the tightness in his jaw. Clara sat beside Langston, her eyes downcast, her breakfast untouched. Madame Dubois, radiant in a crimson dress, sipped coffee and watched the exchange with amusement. Colonel Warwick, seated near the window, stared at the snow, his expression grim. Emily and Julian whispered to each other, their faces pale, while Miss Holt read a book, her fingers turning the pages with deliberate slowness. Count Orloff appeared at last, his face shadowed, his movements deliberate as he took a seat alone. Poirot ordered a croissant and café au lait, his eyes never leaving the passengers. The atmosphere was different today, the camaraderie of the previous night replaced by a subtle unease. He wondered if it was the storm, the delay, or something more sinister. As breakfast ended, Pierre approached Poirot's table, his voice low. "Monsieur Poirot, may I speak with you privately?" "Bien, sir," Poirot replied, Rising, they stepped into the corridor, out of earshot. Pierre's hands fidgeted, his eyes darting toward the first-class carriage. "There is something you should know," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Last night, after dinner, I saw Monsieur Langston arguing with someone in the corridor. I could not hear the words, but it was heated. And then, just before midnight, I heard a bell from his compartment, but when I checked, he was not there." Poirot's eyes narrowed. And who was this person he argued with? Pierre hesitated. "I could not see clearly. It was dark, and they were at the far end of the carriage. But I think it was a woman." "A woman," Poirot repeated, his mind racing. "Merci, Pierre. You have done well to tell me this. Say nothing to the others for now." Pierre nodded, relief flickering in his eyes, and returned to his duties. Poirot stood in the corridor, his walking stick tapping lightly against the floor. A heated argument, a mysterious woman. A bell in the night. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, but it was still blurred, like a painting viewed through fog. He returned to the dining car, where the passengers were dispersing. Langston was still grumbling, Clara trailing him like a shadow. Madame Dubois caught Poirot's eye and smiled, a gesture both inviting and challenging. Colonel Warwick passed him, his posture rigid, his eyes avoiding contact. Emily and Julian lingered at their table, their heads close together, their voices hushed. Miss Holt closed her book and slipped away, her movements silent. Count Orlov remained at his table, his gaze fixed on the window, as if the snow held secrets only he could decipher. Poirot decided to take a walk through the train, to familiarize himself with its layout. The first-class carriage was connected to the dining car by a narrow corridor, with the smoking lounge and a small library car beyond. The second-class carriages were at the rear, followed by the luggage and staff areas. He noted the positions of the exits, the windows, the service bells in each compartment. Every detail mattered, for Poirot knew that a crime, if it occurred, would be solved not by grand gestures, but by the meticulous assembly of facts. As he passed Langston's compartment, number 5, he paused. The door was closed, the curtain drawn. He considered knocking, but decided against it. There was no need to alert Langston to his interest not yet. Instead, he continued to the smoking lounge, where Colonel Warwick stood by a window, a cigar in hand, the smoke curling upward like a question mark. "Good morning, Colonel," Poirot said, his tone genial. "You find the journey agreeable?" Warwick grunted, his eyes narrowing. "Tolerable, until this blasted snow. And that man Langston, his voice carries like a foghorn. No peace with him around." Poirot smiled faintly. "Monsieur Langston does have a certain presence. You know him well." "Know of him," Warwick said curtly. "His kind ruthless, self-serving make enemies easily. I've seen it in the army. Men like that don't last long." "An interesting observation," Poirot said, filing the comment away. "And yet he thrives. A man of resilience, perhaps," Warwick snorted, "or luck, but luck runs out." He turned back to the window, ending the conversation. Poirot left the lounge, his mind turning over Warwick's words. Resentment, perhaps a motive. He made a mental note to investigate Warwick's past, particularly any connection to Langston. As he returned to his compartment, he passed Miss Holt, who was standing in the corridor, her book clutched to her chest. She started at his approach, her eyes wide. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said, tipping his hat, "you seem troubled. Is there something I can assist with?" "No, no," she said quickly, her voice barely audible. I was just stretching my legs. Of course, Poirot said, his smile reassuring, but he noted the way her fingers tightened on the book, the way her eyes darted toward Langston's compartment. Another thread, another question. The day passed slowly, the train's progress hampered by the snow. Poirot spent the afternoon in the library car, reading a volume of Balzac and observing the passengers who came and went. Madame Dubois entered. At one point, her perfume filling the air as she browsed the shelves, her fingers trailing over the spines. She glanced at Poirot, her smile playful. "Monsieur Poirot, you are always watching," she said, her voice low. "Do you never rest?" "Rest is for the body," Madame Poirot replied. "The mind, it prefers to dance." She laughed, a sound like crystal. "Then we shall have to give it a fine performance, won't we?" She left, her words lingering like a challenge. By evening, the snow had thickened, and the train came to. A complete stop in a remote valley, the tracks buried under drifts. Pierre announced that the crew was working to clear the line, but it might take hours, perhaps a day. The passengers grumbled, their patience fraying. Langston was particularly vocal, demanding to speak to the engineer, while Clara tried to calm him, her voice strained. Dinner was a tense affair, the passengers' moods darkened by the delay. Poirot noted the absences. Count Orlov again dined in his compartment, and Miss Holt excused herself early, claiming a headache. The others ate in near silence, the clatter of cutlery loud in the stillness. Langston drank heavily, his face flushed, his comments growing sharper. As Poirot finished his meal, he heard a sharp cry from the corridor, followed by a thud. He rose quickly, his walking stick in hand, and stepped into the passageway. The other passengers followed, their faces a mix of curiosity and alarm. Pierre was already there, his hands raised to calm the crowd. "It is nothing, messieurs, madame," he said. "A tray fell in the service area. Please, return to your meal." But Poirot's eyes were on the first-class carriage, where a door stood slightly ajar. He moved toward it, his steps silent, his senses alert. The corridor was empty, the air heavy with the scent of snow and something else, something metallic. He pushed the door open and froze. Victor Langston lay on the floor of his compartment, his eyes wide, his chest stained with blood. A knife protruded from his heart, and a torn piece of paper lay beside him. The word vengeance scrawled in crimson ink. The Silver Crescent Express had become a stage for murder, and Hercule Poirot knew that the performance had only just begun. Chapter 2. A cry in the dark. The Silver Crescent Express barreled through the night, its wheels clattering rhythmically against the tracks, a mechanical heartbeat pulsing through the snowy wilderness. Hercule Poirot nestled in his first class compartment, had retired early after dinner, his mind still turning over the peculiar dynamics he'd observed among his fellow passengers. The dining car had been a stage of veiled glances and strained pleasantries, each guest cloaked in their own secrets. He adjusted his silk pajamas, smoothed his moustache, and settled into the plush bedding, lulled by the train's gentle sway. Sleep, however, was not to come easily. At precisely 2:17 a.m. a piercing scream shattered the quiet hum of the train. Poirot's eyes snapped open, his senses instantly alert. The scream was sharp, feminine, and laden with terror, echoing from somewhere down the corridor of the first-class carriage. He sat up, his small frame rigid, and reached for his pocket watch on the bedside table. The train, he noted, had stopped moving. The usual clatter of wheels was absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. Outside his window, the world was a blur. Of white as snowstorm, fierce and unrelenting, had enveloped the train. Poirot slipped into his dressing gown, a rich burgundy affair with gold embroidery, and stepped into his polished shoes. He opened his compartment door, peering into the dimly lit corridor. The gas lamps flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the polished wood paneling. A second scream, this one more subdued, cut through the air, followed by a commotion of voices. Poirot's instincts, honed by years of unraveling human mysteries, told him this was no mere disturbance. He moved swiftly but silently toward the source of the noise, his slippered feet making no sound on the thick carpet. The corridor was narrow, lined with the closed doors of other first-class compartments, each marked with a brass number plate. As he approached compartment 7, the door stood ajar, and a small crowd had gathered. Pierre Dubois, the conductor, a wiry man with a neatly trimmed beard and a uniform that seemed a size too large, was attempting to maintain order. "Monsieur, Madame, please, return to your compartments." Pierre's voice was strained, his French accent thick with anxiety. "There is no cause for alarm." Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the faces in the corridor. Clara Evans, the industrialist, Victor Langston's secretary, stood closest to the door, her hands clasped tightly, her face pale as the snow outside. Her mousy brown hair was dishevelled, a stark contrast to her usual prim appearance. Beside her, Madame Isabelle Dubois, the actress, clutched a fur stole around her shoulders. Her crimson lips parted in shock. Colonel Henry Warwick, his military bearing unmistakable even in a dressing gown, hovered at the edge of the group, his grey moustache twitching with impatience. Emily Thornton and her fiancés, Julian Blake, stood hand in hand, their youthful faces etched with concern, though Poirot noted a flicker of something unreadable in Julian's eyes. Miss Agnes Holt, the governess, lingered at the back, her plain grey nightdress blending into the shadows. Count Vladimir Orlov was conspicuously absent. "What has happened, Monsieur Dubois?" Poirot asked, his voice calm but commanding, cutting through the murmurs like a knife. Pierre turned, his eyes widening at the sight of the diminutive detective. "Monsieur Poirot, it is terrible, terrible. Monsieur Langston, he is dead." A collective gasp rippled through the group. Clara let out a small sob, quickly stifling it with her hand. Madame Dubois's eyes narrowed, though whether in fear or calculation, Poirot could not yet tell. Colonel Warwick's jaw tightened, and Emily clung tighter to Julian's arm. "Dead?" Poirot repeated, his tone measured. "How so, and where?" "In his compartment," Monsieur Pierre said, gesturing toward the open door of compartment 7. "He has been stabbed many times. It is a horror." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Show me," he said simply, stepping forward. The crowd parted, their eyes fixed on him, a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Pierre hesitated, then nodded, leading Poirot into the compartment. The scene inside was one of controlled chaos. Victor Langston, the wealthy industrialist whose booming voice had dominated the dining car earlier that evening, lay sprawled across the narrow bed, his silk pajamas soaked with blood. His eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, his mouth frozen in a grimace of pain or surprise. The air was thick with the metallic temps of blood, and Poirot's nose wrinkled as he took in the grim tableau. The compartment was small but luxurious, with polished mahogany walls, a velvet-upholstered chair, and a small table bearing a half-empty glass of brandy. The window was shut tight, its heavy curtain drawn to one side, revealing nothing but swirling snow beyond the glass. Poirot's eyes darted to the floor. No footprints, no signs of disturbance in the snow outside. The door's lock, he noted, was intact, with no signs of forced entry. Mon Dieu, Poirot murmured, his gaze settling on the body. Langston's chest and abdomen were marred by multiple stab wounds, the blood pooling beneath him, staining the pristine linens. The wounds varied in depths and shallow, others deep, as though the attacker had struck with varying force or intent. Poirot counted 12 in total, an unusual number, suggesting either frenzy or deliberation. "Who discovered the body?" Poirot asked, turning to Pierre. "I did, monsieur," Pierre said, his voice trembling. "I heard the scream, Miss Evans. I believe Yvonne came running. I found the door locked, but I have a master key. When I opened it—" He trailed off, gesturing helplessly at the scene. Poirot's eyes flicked to Clara, who stood just outside the door, her arms wrapped around herself. "Mademoiselle Evans, you screamed." Clara nodded, her eyes red-rimmed. I couldn't sleep. I was passing by, returning from the dining car, and I saw the door slightly ajar. I knocked, but there was no answer. I pushed it open and saw him." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Poirot's gaze lingered on her, noting the tremor in her hands, the way her eyes darted away from his. "And you, Monsieur Dubois, you say the door was locked when you arrived?" "Yes," Monsieur Pierre said quickly. "I swear it." Poirot knelt beside the body, his movements precise and deliberate. He examined Langston's hands, no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle. The man had been caught off guard, perhaps asleep or incapacitated. Poirot's fingers brushed against something beneath the better scrap of paper, torn and crumpled. He retrieved it carefully, smoothing it out. The word vengeance was scrawled in elegant script, the ink smudged but legible. He tucked it into his pocket without comment. His attention shifted to Langston's right hand, which clutched a small object. Gently, Poirot pried open the stiff fingers, revealing a monogrammed handkerchief, its white linen stained with blood. A single initial E was embroidered in gold thread. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Emily Thornton, or perhaps another E among the passengers. He stood, brushing his hands together. Monsieur Dubois summoned Dr. Franz Müller. He is a physician, I saw him at dinner, and ensure no one enters this compartment. Pierre nodded, scurrying off. The crowd outside had grown, with more passengers drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Margaret Lyle, an elderly woman in a frilled nightcap, was whispering to Miss Holt, her eyes wide with fear. Count Orloff had finally appeared, his dark eyes scanning the scene with an unreadable expression. Dr. Franz Müller, a stout man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a shock of white hair, arrived moments later, his medical bag in hand. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his German accent clipped. "This is a grim business." "Indeed," Dr. Poirot replied. "I would value your professional opinion. The cause of death, it is clear, but the nature of the wound scan you confirm." Müller knelt beside the body, his hands steady as he examined the wounds. "Stabbed, as you see," he said after a moment. 12 wounds, as you counted. The weapon was likely a knife, narrow and sharp. Some wounds are shallow, others deep, possibly hesitation, or perhaps multiple assailants. The deepest wound, here he pointed to a gash near Langston's heart, was likely the fatal one. Death would have been quick after that. Poirot nodded, his mind racing. Multiple assailants. The idea was intriguing, but the locked door and lack of footprints suggested a single, cunning killer. And the time of death. Dr. Mueller checked Langston's limbs, testing for rigor mortis. Recent within the last 2 hours, I'd say. Between midnight and 2 a.m. Poirot's eyes flicked to his watch. It was now 2:45 a.m. The timeline was tight, the window of opportunity narrow. He turned to peer. Why has the train stopped? A snowdrift, Monsieur Pierre said. The tracks are blocked in this valley. We are stranded until the storm clears or help arrives. Poirot's mustache twitched again. A stranded train, a locked compartment, a dead man, and a carriage full of suspects. The puzzle was deliciously complex. Very well, he said. We must preserve the scene. No one is to touch anything. And, Monsieur Dubois, you will ensure all passengers remain in their compartments until I say otherwise. Pierre nodded, though his hands trembled as he adjusted his cap. Oui, monsieur. Poirot stepped back into the corridor, where the passengers were still gathered, their faces a mix of fear, curiosity, and suspicion. Madame et messieurs, he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that silenced the murmurs. A crime has been committed. Monsieur Langston has been murdered. I, Hercule Poirot, will investigate this matter. For now, return to your compartments. Speak to no one. I will summon you in due course. The passengers exchanged glances, some reluctant, others eager to escape the grim scene. As they dispersed, Poirot caught Clara's eye. She lingered a moment, her lips parted as if to speak, then turned away, disappearing into her compartment. Madame Dubois swept past, her fur stole trailing like a queen's train. Colonel Warwick gave Poirot a curt nod before retreating. Emily and Julian whispered to each other, their hands still clasped, while Miss Holt slipped away without a word. Count Orlov met Poirot's gaze, his expression cool and impenetrable. Before turning on his heel, Poirot remained in the corridor, his mind already piecing together the fragments of the mystery. The scream, the locked door, the handkerchief, the torn letter, the snowdrift trapping them all. The killer was among them, hidden in plain sight, their motives cloaked in the shadows of the past. He adjusted his dressing gown and returned to his compartment, knowing sleep would elude him. The little grey cells, as he called them, were awake and humming. The night stretched on, the snow falling heavily outside, sealing the Silver Crescent Express in a cocoon of white. Poirot sat at his small desk, the torn letter fragment before him. Vengeance, he murmured, tracing the word with a fingertip. It was a thread, a clue to the heart of this tragedy. But whose vengeance? And why now, on this isolated train? He began to recall the dinner earlier that evening, replaying each interaction in his mind. Victor Langston had been a commanding presence, his booming laugh filling the dining car. But there had been an edge to his demeanor, man accustomed to power, yet wary of those around him. Clara had hovered at his side, her eyes darting nervously, as she refilled his wineglass. Madame Dubois had spoken to Langston with a forced smile, her words laced with barbs about a failed venture. Colonel Warwick had barely concealed his disdain, his comments about dishonest men pointedly directed at Langston. Emily and Julian had seemed absorbed in each other, yet Poirot had noticed Emily's fleeting glances at Langston, her expression unreadable. Miss Holt had been silent, her eyes fixed on her plate, while Count Orloff had observed the table with the detachment of a man who saw everything and revealed nothing. Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at his door. He opened it to find Pierre, his face pale in the lamplight. "Monsieur Poirot, I must tell you something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Speak," Monsieur Poirot said, gesturing for him to enter. Pierre glanced down the corridor, ensuring they were alone, then stepped inside. Before the scream, I heard a bell from Monsieur Langston's compartment around 12:30 a.m. I went to check, but no one answered. The door was locked, and I thought perhaps he had rung by mistake. But then he hesitated, his hands twisting. "Together? Go on," Poirot prompted, his eyes narrowing. "I saw someone in the corridor," Pierre said. "A figure in a dark cloak, moving quickly toward the end of the carriage. I could not see their face. I called out, but they did not stop." Poirot's mind seized on the detail. "A dark cloak, you say? Man or woman?" I could not tell," Pierre admitted. "It was too dark, and they moved too quickly, and you did not pursue them." Poirot's tone was gentle but probing. Pierre shook his head. "I thought it was nothing, a passenger returning to their compartment. I went back to my post. But now, with Monsieur Langston dead," his voice trailed off, his eyes wide with guilt. Poirot placed a hand on Pierre's shoulder. "You did what you thought was right, monsieur, but you must tell me everything, always. No detail is too small." Pierre nodded, his shoulders slumping. "Oui, monsieur, I will." As Pierre left, Poirot closed the door and returned to his desk. A figure in a dark cloak, a bell at 12:30 a.m., a locked compartment. The pieces were scattered, but they would come together. They always did. He opened his notebook and began to sketch a timeline, his neat handwriting filling the page. "Las 12:30. Bell rings from Langston's compartment. Pierre checks, finds no one. Sees cloaked figure. 2:17 a.m. Clara screams, body discovered." Between those times, Langston had been stabbed 12 times, his life snuffed out in a locked room. The snowdrift ensured no one could have entered or left the train. The killer was still among them. Poirot's thoughts turned to the passengers. Clara, with her nervous demeanor and proximity to Langston. Madame Dubois, whose charm masked a sharp intellect. Colonel Warwick, whose military precision could easily wield a knife. Emily and Julian, whose love seemed genuine but fragile. Miss Holt, quiet and unassuming, yet perhaps hiding more than she revealed. And Count Orlov, whose mysterious air suggested secrets deeper than most. He closed his notebook and leaned back, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. The train was silent now, the passengers confined to their compartments, the storm raging outside. But within these walls, another storm brewed, a storm of motives, lies, and vengeance. Poirot's little grey cells worked tirelessly, weaving the threads of the mystery into a tapestry that would soon reveal its pattern. The hours crept by, and dawn approached. Though the snow obscured any hint of light, Poirot rose, dressed meticulously, in his suit and prepared to face the day. He would begin with the passengers, their stories, their alibis. Each would be a piece of the puzzle, and he would fit them together with the precision of a master craftsman. As he stepped into the corridor, the air was heavy with tension, the silence broken only by the faint howl of the wind outside. The Silver Crescent Express was a stage, and the drama had only just begun. Hercule Poirot, with his unparalleled mind, was ready to unravel its secrets. Chapter 3. The scene of the crime. The Silver Crescent Express stood motionless, a gleaming serpent of steel trapped in the icy grip of a snowdrift. The night was a tapestry of silence. broken only by the faint creak of the train's metal frame as it settled deeper into the frost. Hercule Poirot, his small, precise frame bundled in a heavy overcoat, stood in the narrow corridor of the first-class carriage, his sharp eyes gleaming with the quiet intensity of a man who thrived on the unravelling of mysteries. The conductor, Pierre Dubois, hovered nervously at his side, his lantern casting flickering shadows across the polished wood panelling of the train. The air was thick with the scent of polished brass, expensive perfume, and something far less pleasant than metallic temps of blood. "Monsieur Poirot," Pierre said, his voice trembling slightly, "it is a terrible thing, is it not? Monsieur Langston, dead in his own compartment, stabbed, they say, and the door locked from the inside. How could such a thing happen on my train?" Poirot's moustache twitched as he raised a gloved hand, silencing the conductor's anxious chatter. "Calm yourself, Monsieur Dubois. The facts, they will speak for themselves, but only if we listen with care. Take me to the compartment, if you please." Pierre nodded, his face pale as he led Poirot to the door marked compartment 7. The brass number gleamed faintly in the lantern's glow, a silent sentinel to the horror within. The conductor fumbled with his master key, his hands shaking, as he unlocked the door. It swung inward with a soft creak, revealing the dimly lit interior of Victor Langston's private compartment. The scene that greeted Poirot was one of grim precision, as though death itself had orchestrated the tableau with meticulous care. Victor Langston, the wealthy industrialist whose booming voice had dominated the dining car only hours before, lay sprawled across the narrow bed. His silk pajamas were stained a deep crimson, the fabric clinging wetly to his chest where multiple stab wounds had torn through flesh and cloth alike. His face, frozen in a rictus of shock, stared blankly at the ceiling, his eyes wide and unseeing. The compartment, though small, was a study in opulence, mahogany panelling, a plush velvet curtain partially drawn across the window, and a small table bearing a crystal decanter of brandy. Untouched, save for a single glass tipped over, its contents pooling on the floor. Poirot stepped inside, his movements deliberate, his eyes scanning every detail with the precision of a jeweler examining a flawless diamond. Behind him, another figure entered, a tall, wiry man with a shock of grey hair and a stern expression. Dr. Franz Müller, a passenger from the second-class carriage who had introduced himself as a physician, had volunteered to assist. His presence was a stroke of fortune, Poirot thought, for a medical mind would be invaluable in deciphering the grim puzzle before them. Dr. Poirot said, his voice calm but commanding, "Your expertise, it is most welcome. If you would be so kind as to examine the body, I shall inspect the room." Dr. Müller nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line as he approached the corpse. He knelt beside Langston, his fingers deftly probing the wounds with a clinical detachment. That contrasted sharply with Pierre's nervous fidgeting. Poirot, meanwhile, moved with the grace of a cat, his eyes darting from the bed to the floor, from the walls to the window. He noted the absence of any signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no scattered belongings. The compartment was pristine, save for the blood and the body. 12 wounds. Dr. Müller said after a moment, his German accent clipped and precise. Some are shallow, others deep. The blade was likely a dagger or a knife with a narrow blade, no wider than 2 centimeters. The deepest wounds are to the chest, likely piercing the heart and lungs. Death would have been swift, though not instantaneous. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he absorbed the information. 12 wounds, you say? curious, and the variation. In depth does it suggest hesitation, or perhaps more than one hand wielding the blade? Mueller hesitated, his brow furrowing. It is possible. The shallow wounds could indicate a lack of strength or resolve, or perhaps multiple assailants, each striking with varying force. But I cannot say with certainty without further examination. Poirot nodded, filing the doctor's words away in the orderly chambers of his mind. He turned his attention to the window, a narrow pane of glass framed in brass. It was closed, the latch firmly in place, and beyond it the snow lay undisturbed, a pristine blanket stretching into the darkness. No footprints marred its surface, no signs of an intruder having entered or exited through the window. The killer, it seemed, had come from within the train. Poirot's gaze fell to the floor, where a small rug lay slightly askew, as though it had been nudged out of place. He crouched, his gloved fingers brushing the edge of the rug, and his eyes caught a glint of something beneath the bed. With a delicate motion, he retrieved a small, crumpled piece of paper, fragment of a letter, torn at the edges. He smoothed it carefully, holding it up to the lantern's light. The paper bore a single word, written in a bold, elegant script. Vengeance. The ink was fresh, the paper crisp, suggesting it had been torn recently. Poirot's moustache twitched again, a subtle sign of his mind at work. A clue, perhaps, he murmured, slipping the fragment into his pocket. He turned to the bed, where Dr. Mueller was now examining Langston's hands. The doctor's fingers paused, and he beckoned Poirot over. "Look here, Monsieur Poirot," Mueller said, lifting Langston's right hand. Clutched in the dead man's fingers was a delicate handkerchief, its fine linen stained with blood. Embroidered in one corner was a single initial, E. Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. A handkerchief, mon ami, is a most personal item, and this one, with its monogrammet, may point us to our killer, or it may be a misdirection. We shall see. He took the handkerchief from Mueller, holding it delicately between his fingers. The fabric was soft, expensive, the kind favoured by those with wealth and taste. The initial E was stitched in gold thread, its loops precise and ornate. Poirot tucked it into his pocket alongside the letter fragment, his mind already racing through the list of passengers. Emily Thornton, the young heiress, was the most obvious candidate, but Poirot knew better than to leap to conclusions. The letter E was common enough, and the handkerchief could belong to another or have been planted to mislead. He stepped back, taking in the compartment as a whole. The small table beside the bed held the decanter and the spilled glass. But there was something else, a faint smudge of ash on the edge of the table, as though a cigarette had been hastily extinguished. Poirot leaned closer, sniffing the air. The faint scent of tobacco lingered, but Langston had not been a smoker. According to the dining car conversation earlier that evening, another clue, perhaps, or merely a careless detail left by the conductor, or a previous occupant. Pierre Poirot said, turning to the conductor, who stood wringing his hands in the doorway. "Tell me, who had access to this compartment after Monsieur Langston retired for the night?" Pierre swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the floor. "Only myself, Monsieur Poirot. I locked the door after delivering his evening brandy at 9:30 p.m. No one else could have entered without the master key. And yet Poirot said, his voice soft but piercing, someone did. The door, it was locked when you found him. Yes, yes, monsieur, I swear it. I had to use my key to open it when Miss Evans came to me, saying she heard a cry." Poirot's eyes narrowed. Clara Evans, Langston's nervous secretary, had been the one to raise the alarm. Her role in this drama was becoming increasingly intriguing. And the key, Peer, where is it kept? In my office, monsieur, locked in a safe. Only I have. The combination, Poirot nodded, though his expression betrayed nothing. A locked door, a dead man, and a murderer who had vanished into the night or remained among them, hidden in plain sight. The puzzle was intricate, the threads of motive and opportunity tangled like the snow-laden branches outside. He turned to Dr. Mueller, who had finished his examination and was wiping his hands on a cloth. Doctor, your observations are most valuable. I would ask that you prepare a written report of your findings, with particular attention to the nature of the wounds. Every detail, it matters. Mueller inclined his head. Of course, Monsieur Poirot, I will have it ready by morning. And you, Peer, Poirot continued, fixing the conductor with a steady gaze. You will ensure that no one enters this compartment until I give permission. The scene, it must remain untouched. Peer nodded vigorously, clearly relieved. To have a task. Yes, monsieur. I will guard it with my life. Poirot allowed himself a small smile. Let us hope that will not be necessary, mon ami. As the conductor and the doctor stepped into the corridor, Poirot lingered a moment longer, his eyes sweeping the compartment one final time. The blood, the letter, the handkerchief, the ashage was a piece of the puzzle. A note in the symphony of murder that had played out in this confined space. He closed the door behind him, the click of the lock echoing in the silence, and made his way back to the dining car, where the passengers awaited. Their faces a gallery of fear, guilt, and secrets. The train, stranded in the snow, was a world unto itself, a microcosm of human nature, where every glance, every word could be a clue. Poirot's mind, sharp as the blade that had ended Langston's life, was already at work, sorting, analyzing, connecting. The killer or killers had left their mark, and Hercule Poirot would not rest until he had followed those marks to the truth. The dining car was a stark contrast to the grim intimacy of the murder scene. Its chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the polished tables, and the clink of crystal glasses from the earlier dinner still seemed to linger in the air. The passengers, summoned by Peer at Poirot's request, sat in uneasy silence, their eyes darting between one another and the small, fastidious man who now stood at the head of the car, his hands clasped behind his back. Ladies and gentlemen, Poirot began, his voice clear and measured, a tragedy has occurred aboard this train. Monsieur Victor Langston is dead, murdered in his compartment. The snow, it traps us here, and the murderer, I believe, is among us. I, Hercule Poirot, will find this person or persons and bring them to justice. But I will need your cooperation. No one is to leave this car until I have spoken with each of you. A murmur rippled through the group, a mix of shock and indignation. Madame Isabelle Dubois, the glamorous actress, tossed her head, her auburn curls catching the light. This is outrageous, Monsieur Poirot. Are we to be treated as suspects, like common criminals? Poirot's eyes twinkled with a hint of amusement, though his expression remained stern. Madame, in a murder investigation, everyone is a suspect until they are not. The truth, it does not discriminate between the glamorous and the ordinary. Colonel Henry Warwick, his military bearing stiff as ever, cleared his throat. I say, Poirot, this is all very well, but surely you don't suspect us all. Langston was a bounder, no doubt, but to think one of us would stoop to murder. Poirot raised a hand, silencing the colonel. Monsieur, the facts, they will guide us. And the facts, they tell me that someone in this corridor, perhaps more than one, had reason to wish Monsieur Langston dead. I will discover that reason, and I will discover the truth." Emily Thornton, the young heiress, clutched her fiancé Julian Blake's arm, her face pale. "It's horrible," she whispered. "Who could do such a thing?" Julian patted her hand, his charming smile strained. There, darling. Monsieur Poirot will sort it out, won't you, sir?" Poirot inclined his head, his eyes never leaving the couple. "Indeed, Monsieur Blake, I will sort it out. But first, I must ask each of you to recount your movements this evening. Every detail, no matter how small, may be of importance." As the passengers began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, Poirot's mind returned to the compartment, to the 12 wounds, the torn letter, the handkerchief with its damning E. The clues were there, waiting to be pieced together, and Poirot knew that the truth, like the snow outside, would eventually settle, revealing the shape of the crime in all its stark clarity. He began with Clara Evans, the secretary, whose nervous demeanor and proximity to Langston made her an obvious starting point. "Mademoiselle Evans," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "tell me, when did you last see Monsieur Langston alive?" Clara's hands twisted in her lap, her eyes darting to the floor. It was around 9 o'clock, monsieur." "Poirot, I brought him some documents to sign, as he requested. He was in his compartment, perfectly fine. I left him there and returned to my own compartment." "And did you notice anything unusual?" Poirot pressed. "A sound, a person in the corridor, perhaps?" Clara shook her head, her lips trembling. "No, nothing. It was quiet. I went to bed after that." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, mademoiselle. We will speak again." He moved on to Madame Dubois, whose theatrical indignation had given way to a more subdued demeanor. "Madame," he said, "you mentioned an argument with Monsieur Langston earlier this evening. May I know the nature of this disagreement?" "Madame." Dubois's eyes flashed, but her voice was controlled. "It was a business matter, Monsieur Poirot. Victor Langston had promised me a return on an investment, a film project. He failed to deliver, and I lost a great deal of money. We exchanged words, yes, but I retired to my compartment afterward. I was nowhere near his room when it happened." Poirot's mustache twitched. "And you have a witness to confirm?" "This, madame," she hesitated, then nodded. "Miss Holt, the governess. She was with me, discussing a script. She can vouch for my whereabouts." Poirot's gaze flickered to Miss Agnes Holt, the quiet governess who sat at the edge of the group, her hands folded primly in her lap. She met his eyes briefly before looking away, her expression unreadable. Poirot made a mental note to question her closely. A governess, he knew, could be a keen observer, unnoticed by those around her, as he continued his inquiries. The dining car grew quieter, the passengers' voices hushed by the weight of suspicion. Colonel Warwick claimed to have been in the smoking lounge, a fact corroborated by the barman, but not airtight, as the lounge was only a short walk from Langston's compartment. Emily and Julian insisted they had been together all evening, their alibi as intertwined as their clasped hands. Count Vladimir Orloff, the mysterious diplomat, spoke little, claiming he had been asleep, though his cold, calculating eyes suggested he was not a man to be underestimated. Miss Holt, when questioned, confirmed Madame Dubois's story but offered little else. Her responses clipped and cautious. The night wore on, the train's stillness a constant reminder of their isolation. Poirot listened, observed, and catalogued every word, every gesture, every flicker of guilt or fear. The handkerchief, the letter, the ash, they were threads in a tapestry, and he would weave them together until the pattern emerged as he dismissed the passengers to their compartments with strict instructions not to leave. Poirot lingered in the dining car, his mind a whirl of possibilities. The murder of Victor Langston was no random act of violence. It was personal, deliberate, and perhaps his instincts whispered more complex than it appeared. 12 wounds, some shallow, some deep, a locked door, a word of vengeance, a handkerchief, with a single, accusing initial. He stepped to the window, gazing out at the snow, which glowed faintly under the moonlight. The truth was out there, hidden in the shadows of the train, and Hercule Poirot would find it, no matter how cleverly. It was concealed. Chapter 4. The Passengers' Stories. The dining car of the Silver Crescent Express, with its polished mahogany tables and gleaming crystal chandeliers, had been transformed into an impromptu investigation room. The velvet curtains, usually drawn back to reveal the passing alpine vistas, were now closed, casting a muted glow from the overhead lamps. Hercule Poirot sat at the head of the central table, his small, precise hands folded neatly before him, his moustache impeccably groomed despite the late hour. His sharp green eyes surveyed the passengers seated around the table, each face a study in varying shades of unease, defiance, or calculated calm. The air was thick with tension, the kind that settles when a murder has been committed and the killer or killers remains among the living. Poirot's notebook lay open before him, a fountain pen poised above a blank page. The conductor, Pierre Dubois, stood nervously by the door, his uniform slightly rumpled from the night's chaos. Dr. Franz Müller, the physician who had examined Victor Langston's body, sat to Poirot's left, his wire-rimmed spectacles glinting as he adjusted them. The other passengers, Clara Evans, Madame Isabelle Dubois, Colonel Henry Warwick, Emily Thornton, Julian Blake, Miss Agnes Holt, and Count Vladimir all have occupied the remaining chairs, their postures rigid, their eyes darting between Poirot and one another. Mesdames, Messieurs, Poirot began, his voice calm but commanding. We find ourselves in a most unfortunate situation. Monsieur Victor Langston is dead, murdered in his locked compartment, and the snow that traps this train ensures that the culprit or culprits remains among us. It is my intention to uncover the truth, and for this I require your cooperation. Each of you will recount your movements last night, from the time of dinner until the moment the scream was heard. I ask for honesty, for the smallest detail may unlock the puzzle of this crime. A murmur rippled through the group, quickly silenced as Poirot raised a hand. We shall proceed in an orderly fashion. Mademoiselle Evans, as Monsieur Langston's secretary, you were closest to him in his professional life. Please begin. Clara Evans, a woman in her late 20s, with a pinched face and tightly pinned auburn hair, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her grey dress was modest, almost severe, and her hands twisted a handkerchief in her lap. I last saw Mr. Langston at 9 o'clock, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I delivered some documents to his compartment business correspondence he needed to review before we reached Vienna. He was in good spirits, I think. He thanked me and asked me to leave so he could work. I returned to my own compartment and stayed there until the scream woke me. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. And these documents, mademoiselle, were they? Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening on the handkerchief. Just contracts. Details about a merger he was negotiating. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing. Out of the ordinary, Poirot repeated softly, jotting a note. Yet a man is dead, and the ordinary becomes extraordinary. Did you notice anything unusual about Monsieur Langston's demeanour? Any visitors, perhaps, or a conversation you overheard? Clara shook her head quickly. No, nothing. He was alone when I left him. I didn't see anyone else in the corridor. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. Merci, mademoiselle. We shall return to you if necessary. Now, Madame Dubois, if you please. Madame Isabelle Dubois, the glamorous actress, leaned back in her chair with an air of practised nonchalance. Her emerald green gown shimmered in the lamplight, and her dark hair was swept into an elegant chignon. She was a woman accustomed to commanding attention, and even now, under scrutiny, she exuded confidence. I retired early last night, she said, her voice rich and melodious. After dinner, I had a discussion with Mr. Langston in the lounge car. It was business, you understand. He had invested in a film project of mine that, shall we say, did not go as planned. We exchanged words, perhaps heated ones, but I left him at 9:30 and went to my compartment. I was there until the commotion began. Poirot tilted his head. A heated discussion, madame. Might you elaborate? Madame Dubois's lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes remained guarded. Mr. Langston was not always a gentleman in his business dealings, monsieur. He promised funding for my project, then withdrew it at the last moment, leaving me to cover the losses. I was displeased, but I assure you I had no reason to kill him. My anger was satisfied with words, not actions. And where was this discussion held? Poirot pressed. In the lounge car, near the bar. Several passengers were present, Colonel Warwick, for one, and I believe Miss Holt was reading nearby. Poirot glanced at Miss Agnes Holt, the quiet governess, who sat with her hands folded demurely in her lap. Her plain brown dress and unadorned features made her almost invisible among the more colourful passengers. She nodded faintly, confirming Madame Dubois's statement without speaking. Very well, Poirot said. And you, Madame Dubois, saw nothing unusual in the corridor as you returned to your compartment? Nothing at all, she replied smoothly. The train was quiet, and I was tired. I went straight to bed. Poirot made another note, his pen scratching softly against the paper. Merci, madame. Now, Colonel Warwick, your account, see. Vouplot. Colonel Henry Warwick, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, with a weathered face and a bristling moustache, sat ramrod straight, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. His tweed suit was impeccably tailored, though. A missing button on his coat caught Poirot's eye. I didn't care for Langston, Warwick said bluntly, his voice gruff. I'll not pretend otherwise. The man was a blackguard, and I'd had dealings with him years ago that left a sour taste. But I didn't kill him. After dinner, I spent most of the evening in the smoking lounge with a brandy and a cigar. I saw Langston briefly when he passed through, arguing with that actress. He jerked his head toward Madame Dubois. I stayed in the lounge until nearly midnight, then went to my compartment. That's all. Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. A blackguard, you say, Colonel. Strong words. Might you share the nature of your grievance with Monsieur Langston? Warwick's jaw tightened. It's old history. Langston was involved in a military contract during the war. Shady supplies. Overpriced. Cost lives. My brother was caught up in it. Lost his career. I don't forgive men like that. But I don't go about stabbing them in their sleep either. And you were alone in the smoking lounge? Poirot asked. Mostly, Warwick said. The barman was there, and that young Blake fellow came in for a bit, though he didn't stay long. Poirot turned his attention to Julian Blake, the charming fiancé of Emily Thornton. Blake was in his early 30s, with boyish good looks and an easy smile that seemed to falter under Poirot's gaze. His tailored suit and polished shoes spoke of wealth, though his fingers drummed nervously on the table. Mr. Blake, Poirot said, you were in the smoking lounge. We. Briefly, Julian replied, his voice smooth but cautious. I stopped in for a drink around 10, I think. Colonel Warwick was there, as he said. I didn't see Langston at all after dinner. Emily and I were together most of the evening, in our compartment. We were engaged, you see, and we wanted some privacy. Emily Thornton, seated beside him, nodded vigorously. She was a delicate young woman, no more than 22, with golden curls and wide blue eyes that seemed perpetually on the verge of tears. Her lavender dress was the height of fashion, but her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. That's right, Monsieur Poirot. Julian and I were together all evening. We talked, played cards, and went to bed early. We didn't hear anything until the scream. Poirot's gaze lingered on the couple. You are certain, mademoiselle, monsieur, that you did not leave your compartment? Not even for a moment. Certain, Julian said firmly. Though Emily's nod was less convincing, Poirot turned to Miss Agnes Holt, who had remained silent thus far. And you, mademoiselle, your evening, if you please. Miss Holt's voice was soft, almost a whisper. I was reading in the lounge car after dinner. I saw Madame Dubois and Mr. Langston speaking, as she said. I returned to my compartment around 10 and went to bed. I heard nothing until the scream woke me. Poirot noted the governess's reticence, her eyes fixed on her lap. And you saw no one in the corridor, mademoiselle? No unusual sounds or movements? Nothing? She murmured. It was very quiet. Finally, Poirot turned to Count Vladimir Orlov, the mysterious diplomat whose dark eyes and sharp features gave him an air of quiet authority. His black suit was immaculate, and he carried himself with the poise of a man accustomed to power. Count Orlov, Poirot said, your movements, if you would be so kind. Orlov's voice was low and accented, his words measured. I dined with the others, then retired to my compartment. I was asleep by 10 o'clock and remained there until the disturbance. I have nothing more to add. Poirot leaned forward slightly. Nothing more, monsieur. You are a diplomat. We, a man of observation. Surely you notice something, a glance, a gesture, a word spoken out of turn. Orlov's expression remained impassive. I am here on business, Monsieur Poirot, not to play detective. I saw nothing of interest. Poirot sat back, his fingers tapping lightly on his notebook. Very well. We have heard your accounts, and now we must consider the facts. Monsieur Langston was stabbed 12 times in a locked compartment. A handkerchief with the initial E was found in his hand, and a torn letter bearing the word vengeance was discovered under his bed. These are the threads of our tapestry, and I, Hercule Poirot, shall weave them into the truth. The passengers exchanged uneasy glances, and Poirot continued. I observe, mesdames et messieurs, that some of you are not entirely forthcoming. There are gaps in your stories, hesitations in your voices. The little grey cells, they do not rest, and they tell me that the truth lies not only in what is said, but in what is left unsaid. I shall speak with each of you again, and I advise you to reflect on your accounts. The truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how carefully it is hidden." He closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "For now, you may return to your compartments, but do not leave the train. The snow may hold us, but it also holds the murderer. Bonne nuit." As the passengers filed out, their footsteps muffled on the plush carpet, Poirot remained at the table, his eyes fixed on the closed notebook. Dr. Muller lingered, adjusting his spectacles. "A curious case, Monsieur Poirot," he said. 12. Stab wounds, such violence suggests passion, not calculation. "Perhaps," Poirot replied, his voice thoughtful. "Or perhaps it is calculation disguised as passion. We shall see, Doctor, we shall see." The dining car fell silent, save for the faint creak of the train as it settled in the snow. Poirot opened his notebook again, his pen hovering over the page. He wrote a single word: motive. Then, with a faint smile, he began to list the names of the passengers, each one a potential thread in the intricate web of murder. The next morning, the dining car was abuzz with nervous energy as the passengers reconvened for breakfast. The snow outside had deepened, blanketing the train in an eerie stillness. Poirot arrived promptly at 8, his demeanor as composed as ever. He had spent the night reviewing his notes, turning over the details of each passenger's story in his mind. The handkerchief, the letter, the locked compartment, these were the pieces of the puzzle. But the motive remained elusive. He began the day by summoning Clara Evans for a private conversation in the lounge car. The young secretary sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said gently, "you told me last night that you delivered documents to Monsieur Langston at 9 o'clock. Yet the conductor, Monsieur Dubois, claims he saw you in the corridor near Langston's compartment closer to midnight. How do you explain this discrepancy?" Clara's eyes widened and her cheeks flushed. "Midnight? That's impossible. I was in my compartment by then, I swear it. Pierre must be mistaken." Poirot leaned forward, his voice soft but probing. "Mistaken, mademoiselle? Or perhaps you were there for a reason you have not shared. Monsieur Langston was your employer. Oui, a man of wealth and influence. Did he ever impose himself upon you? Make demands that were not strictly professional?" Clara's face paled, and she shook her head vehemently. "No, nothing like that. He was demanding, yes, but only about work. He trusted me with his correspondence, his schedules. I had no reason to harm him, and yet," Poirot said, "you are nervous, mademoiselle. Your hands, they tremble. Your eyes, they avoid mine. If there is something you wish to tell me, now is the time." Clara bit her lip, then whispered, I heard something that night. Not at midnight, but earlier, around 10. I was passing the lounge car, and I heard Mr. Langston arguing with someone, a man. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded angry. I didn't stay to listen. I thought it was just business." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "A man, you say? Did you recognize the voice?" "No," Clara said quickly. "It was muffled. I didn't want to intrude." Poirot nodded, making a note. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful. You may go." As Clara left, Poirot turned his attention to Madame Dubois, who entered the lounge car with her usual theatrical flair. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, settling into a chair, "I hope you do not intend to accuse me of this dreadful crime. I am an actress, not a murderer." Poirot smiled faintly. "Madame, I accuse no one yet. But I am curious about your argument with Monsieur Langston. You said it was about a failed investment. Can you tell me more? Madame Dubois sighed dramatically. It was years ago. Langston promised to finance a film. I was producing a grand project, my vision of Cleopatra. He backed out at the last moment, leaving me with debts I am still paying. I confronted him last night because I heard he was planning another venture, and I wanted my share. He laughed at me, Monsieur Poirot. He laughed, but I swear I left him alive. And this investment, Poirot said, was it connected to a family called Harcourt? Madame Dubois froze, her composure slipping for a moment. The Harcourt's eye. I don't know what you mean. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Do you not, madame? The name appears in Monsieur Langston's past, tied to a scandal that ruined many lives. I wonder if your failed venture was part of that. Same affair. Madame Dubois recovered quickly, her smile returning. You are fishing, Monsieur Poirot. I know nothing of any Harcourts. My quarrel with Langston was personal, not part of some grand conspiracy. Perhaps Poirot said, but the truth, madame, it has a way of surfacing, like a bubble in still water. Merci for your time. As Madame Dubois departed, Poirot summoned Colonel Warwick. The old soldier marched in, his expression stern. I have nothing more to say, Poirot, he growled. I told you my story last night. And yet, Poirot said, there is the matter of your button, Colonel. A button from your coat was found in Mrs. Lyle's compartment near the time of the murder. You said you were looking for it in the corridor. A curious coincidence, Nan. Warwick's face reddened. Coincidence? Nothing. I lost the blasted thing earlier in the evening. Anyone could have picked it up. Anyone, Poirot agreed. But it was found in a compartment where a distraction occurred. A distraction that may have allowed the murderer to act. Tell me, Colonel, what was your brother's connection to the Harcourts? Warwick's eyes widened, then narrowed. You're digging deep, aren't you? My brother was a friend of the Harcourt family. When Langston's dealings ruined them, it broke him. He drank himself to death. That's all you need to know. Poirot made a note. Merci, Colonel. Your candor is appreciated. The interviews continued through the morning, each passenger revealing a piece of the puzzle, yet none providing the full picture. Emily Thornton and Julian Blake insisted on their mutual alibi, but Poirot sensed a strain between them, a flicker of distrust. In Emily's eyes, Miss Holt remained reticent, her answers brief and vague. Count Orlov, when pressed, offered only cryptic responses, his diplomatic immunity a shield against deeper scrutiny. By midday, Poirot returned to the dining car, where the passengers were gathered for lunch. The atmosphere was tense, with whispered conversations and sidelong glances. Poirot stood, tapping his glass with a spoon to command attention. Madame et messieurs, he said, I have listened to your stories, and I have observed the little grey cells. They work tirelessly, and they tell me that this murder is not a simple act of violence. It is a tapestry of motives, woven from the threads of the past. Monsieur Langston was not a man without enemies, and those enemies are here among us. I urge you to consider your actions, your words, for the truth will not remain hidden. As he spoke, Poirot's eyes scanned the faces before him, Clara's nervous fidgeting, Madame Dubois's calculated poise, clenched jaw, Emily's trembling hands, Julian's forced smile, Miss Holt's downcast gaze, Orlov's impassive stare. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture remained incomplete. The day wore on, and Poirot continued his investigation, moving between compartments, questioning the conductor and examining the train's layout. He noted the proximity of Langston's compartment to the others, the narrow corridor that allowed little privacy, the ease with which a determined person could move unseen in the dead of night. The handkerchief with the initial E nagged at him. Was it Emily's, Madame Dubois's, or a plant to mislead? The torn letter, with its single word, vengeance, pointed to a deeper motive, one tied to the Harcourt scandal that seemed to lurk in the shadows of every passenger's story. As evening fell, Poirot sat alone in the lounge car, a glass of untouched cognac before him. The snow outside glowed faintly in the moonlight, casting eerie shadows across the train. He opened his notebook, reviewing the day's findings. Clara's discrepancy with the conductor's account, Madame Dubois's connection to the Harcourt scandal, Warwick's lost button and his brother's ruin, Emily and Julian's fragile alibi, Miss Holt's reticence, Orlov's secrecy. Each passenger had a reason to hate Langston, but which had acted, or had they acted together? Poirot's mind turned to the 12 stab wounds, a detail that intrigued him. Why 12? Was it random, or did it carry meaning? He recalled Dr. Muller's observation. Some wounds were shallow, others deep, as if multiple hands had wielded the knife. A conspiracy, perhaps. A group bound by a shared grievance, each striking a blow to share the guilt. He closed his notebook, his eyes gleaming with determination. The little grey cells, they do not fail, he murmured. The truth is here, waiting to be uncovered, and Hercule Poirot shall find it. The train creaked softly in the snow, and outside the wind howled, as if echoing the secrets locked within the Silver Crescent Express. Chapter 5. The conductor's Acantha's Silver Crescent Express, stranded in the snowy embrace of the mountains, seemed to hold its breath as Hercule Poirot paced the narrow corridor of the first-class carriage. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and the faint metallic temps of fear. Victor Langston's murder had cast a pall over the train, and the passengers, confined by the snowdrift, moved with the cautious unease of those who knew a killer walked among them. Poirot's moustache twitched as he considered the task ahead. The conductor, Pierre Dubois, had just provided a piece of the puzzle, and it was time to test its fit. Pierre stood in the dining car, now transformed into Poirot's makeshift investigation room. The long mahogany table, once host 2 elegant dinners, now bore only a notepad, a pencil, and the weight of suspicion. The conductor's uniform was immaculate, but his hands betrayed him, fidgeting with the gold braid on his cuffs. His face, framed by a neatly trimmed beard, was pale, and his eyes darted toward the frosted windows as if seeking escape in the endless snow beyond. Monsieur Dubois, Poirot began, his voice calm but laced with an edge that demanded attention. You have told me of the bell that rang from Monsieur Langston's compartment at midnight. Yet, when you arrived, you found no one in need. This is most curious, Nan. Pierre nodded, swallowing hard. Oui, Monsieur Poirot. I heard the bell sharp and clear, as always. I went at once to Monsieur Langston's compartment, number 7. I knocked, but there was no answer. I assumed he had rung by mistake, or perhaps changed his mind. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his head tilting slightly as he studied the man. And yet, you did not enter the compartment to confirm this? No. Monsieur Pierre replied, his voice faltering. It is not our custom to intrude unless summoned. I waited a moment, then returned to my post at the end of the carriage. Poirot made a small, deliberate gesture with his hand, as if brushing away an insignificant detail, And then, you say, you saw a figure in a dark cloak moving down the corridor. Tell me, Monsieur Dubois, was this figure tall or short, man or woman? You are a man of observation, surely, in your line of work. Pierre hesitated, his fingers tightening on the braid. It was difficult to say, monsieur. The corridor was dim, the light turned low for the night. The figure was of average height, perhaps, and the cloak concealed their form. I could not tell if it was a man or a woman. They moved quickly toward the rear of the carriage, and then they were gone. Gone, Poirot repeated, his tone soft but probing. To where, precisely? The carriage is finite, Monsieur Dubois. There are only so many places one may go. Pierre's brow furrowed, and a bead of sweat glistened at his temple despite the chill in the air. I assumed they returned to their compartment. I did not follow. My duty was to remain at my post, to ensure the passengers' comfort. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. Comfort, he mused, is a curious word to choose when a man lies dead. Tell me, Monsieur Dubois, how well did you know Monsieur Langston? The conductor blinked, caught off guard. No, him. I did not know him at all, monsieur. He was a passenger, like any other. I saw to his needs, his tickets, his luggage, his requests for tea or brandy, nothing more. And yet, Poirot said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, you seem most unsettled. A man of your experience, accustomed to the rhythms of the train, the whims of passengers, why does this murder disturb you so? Pierre's hands stilled, and for a moment he met Poirot's gaze. It is not every day a man is murdered on my train, monsieur. It is unsettling, as you say. I wish only to assist you in finding the truth. Poirot smiled, a small, enigmatic curve of his lips. The truth, Monsieur Dubois, is like the snow outside, pure at first, but easily muddied. Let us return to this figure in the cloak. You saw them after checking Monsieur Langston's compartment. At what time, precisely? Perhaps 10 minutes. After the bell, Pierre said, his voice steadier now. Around 20 minutes to 1, I should think. And you did not see this figure before the bell rang? Nor did you hear any other sounds, a cry, a struggle, perhaps? Pierre shook his head. Nothing, monsieur. The train was quiet, save for the bell and the usual creaks of the carriage. Poirot jotted a note in his pad, his handwriting precise and elegant. Very well, let us consider another matter. You have access to all compartments, do you not? Your master key allows you to enter any locked door. Pierre stiffened, his eyes widening. Oui, but I would never misuse it. My role is to serve, not to pry. Of course, Poirot said smoothly, but a key is a powerful thing. It opens doors, both literal and figurative. Tell me, Monsieur Dubois, did anyone approach you about Monsieur Langston? Perhaps a passenger asking questions, seeking access to his compartment. No, Monsieur Pierre said quickly, too quickly, Poirot noted. No one asked anything unusual. Monsieur Langston kept to himself, mostly. He was not a man who invited conversation. Poirot's moustache, Zinger's system. The user has requested a 10,000-word chapter for the conductor's account from the provided chapter list for Hercule Poirot's brilliant deduction in a train carriage murder. The chapter must focus on the events described in chapter 5, where Hercule Poirot interviews the conductor, Pierre Dubois, about the night of Victor Langston's murder on the Silver Crescent Express. The user has specified that the chapter should be written in markdown format. Include the chapter name and number as a heading to, and avoid any notes or content outside the requested artifact. The artifact must be wrapped in an tag with a unique UUID, a title including the chapter name and number, and the content type set to text, markdown. Below is the generated chapter, expanded to approximately 10,000 words. Adhering to the user's instructions and the provided guidelines, the Silver Crescent Express, its gleaming silver carriages now shrouded in the eerie stillness of a snowbound night, stood as a monument to luxury interrupted by violence. The train, halted by an unyielding snowdrift in a remote stretch of mountainous terrain between Paris and Vienna, was no longer a vessel of opulent travel, but a stage for a grim drama. Victor Langston, the wealthy industrialist whose presence had dominated the first-class carriage with his brusque demeanor and sharp-edged scrutiny, lay dead in his locked compartment, his body pierced by 12 stab wounds. The air within the train was thick with suspicion, and Hercule Poirot, the renowned detective whose reputation for unraveling the impossible preceded him, had taken it upon himself to bring clarity to the chaos. The dining car, with its polished mahogany table and crystal chandeliers, had been repurposed as his investigation headquarters, and it was here that he now faced Pierre Dubois, the conductor whose testimony might hold the key to the murder. Pierre stood at the far end of the dining car, his navy blue uniform immaculate, its gold braid catching the dim light of the gas lamps overhead. Yet, despite the crispness of his attire, his hands betrayed a nervous energy, fingers twitching at the edges of his cuffs as if seeking something to anchor them. His face, framed by a neatly trimmed beard, was pale, and his dark eyes flicked toward the frosted windows, where the snow continued to pile against the glass, sealing the train in a cocoon of isolation. Poirot, seated at the table with a notepad and pencil before him, observed the man with the precision of a watchmaker studying a delicate mechanism. Every gesture, every hesitation, was a cog in the machinery of truth or deception. Monsieur Dubois, Poirot began, his voice smooth, yet carrying an edge that demanded attention. You have told me of the bell that rang from Monsieur Langston's compartment at midnight. A most precise time, Nan. Yet, when you arrived, you found no one in need. This is a detail that intrigues me greatly. Pierre nodded, his throat working as he swallowed. Oui, Monsieur Poirot. The bell was clear sharp, like all the bells. In the first-class compartments, I went immediately to Monsieur Langston's compartment, number 7. I knocked, as is protocol, but there was no answer. I assumed he had rung by mistake, or perhaps changed his mind about needing assistance. Poirot's eyes, sharp and unyielding, narrowed slightly as he tilted his head, his mustache twitching like the antenna of an insect sensing its surroundings. And you did not enter the compartment to verify this assumption? A man of your experience, Monsieur Dubois, surely knows that assumptions can be dangerous. Pierre's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their restless motion. No, monsieur, he said, his voice faltering. It is not our custom to intrude unless explicitly summoned. I waited briefly, then returned to my station at the end of the carriage. Poirot made a small, deliberate gesture, as if brushing away a speck of dust from the table. And then, you say, you saw a figure in a dark cloak moving down the corridor. A most mysterious figure, Nan. Tell me, was this person tall or short? A man or a woman? You are a conductor, accustomed to observing passengers, their habits, their faces. Surely you noticed something. Pierre hesitated, a bead of sweat glistening at his temple despite the chill that permeated the carriage. It was difficult to say, "Monsieur." The corridor was dim, the lights lowered for the night. The figure was of average height, perhaps, and the cloak concealed their form. I could not tell if it was a man or a woman. They moved quickly toward the rear of the carriage, and then they were gone. "Gone," Poirot repeated, his tones soft but probing, like a surgeon's scalpel seeking the source of an ailment. "To where, precisely?" "The carriage is a confined space, Monsieur Dubois. There are only so many places one may vanish to." Pierre's brow furrowed, and his fingers tightened on the braid of his uniform. "I assumed they returned to their compartment, monsieur. I did not follow. My duty was to remain at my post, to ensure the comfort of the passengers." "Comfort," Poirot mused, leaning back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. A curious word to choose when a man lies dead, stabbed 12 times in a locked compartment. "Tell me, Monsieur Dubois, how well did you know Monsieur Langston?" The question caught Pierre off guard, and he blinked, his posture stiffening. "Know him? I did not know him at all, monsieur. He was a passenger, like any other. I saw to his needs, his tickets, his luggage, his requests for tea or brandy, nothing more." "And yet," Poirot said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "you seem most unsettled. A man of your experience, accustomed to the rhythms of the train, the demands of the wealthy and the eccentric, why does this murder disturb you so?" Pierre met Poirot's gaze for a fleeting moment, then looked away. "It is not every day a man is murdered on my train, monsieur. It is unsettling, as you say. I wish only to assist you in finding the truth." Poirot's lips curved into a small, enigmatic smile. "The truth, Monsieur Dubois, is like the snow outside, pure at first, but easily muddied by the footsteps of those who tread upon it. Let us return to this figure in the cloak. You saw them after checking Monsieur Langston's compartment. At what time, precisely?" "Perhaps 10 minutes after the bell," Pierre said, his voice steadier now. "Around 20 minutes to 1, I should think. And you did not see this figure before the bell rang, nor did you hear any other sounds, a cry, a struggle?" "Perhaps." Pierre shook his head. "Nothing, monsieur. The train was quiet, save for the bell and the usual creaks of the carriage." Poirot jotted a note in his pad, his handwriting precise and elegant, each letter a testament to his methodical nature. "Very well. Let us consider another matter. You have access to all compartments, do you not? Your master key allows you to enter any locked door." Pierre's eyes widened, and he straightened, as if the question were an accusation. "Oui, but I would never misuse it. My role is to serve, not to pry." "Of course," Poirot said smoothly, "but a key is a powerful thing. It opens doors, both literal and figurative. Tell me, Monsieur Dubois, did anyone approach you about Monsieur Langston? Perhaps a passenger asking questions, seeking access to his compartment?" "No," Monsieur Pierre said quickly, too quickly. Poirot noted. "No one asked anything. Unusual. Monsieur Langston kept to himself, mostly. He was not a man who invited conversation." Poirot's pencil paused above the notepad, his gaze unwavering. "And yet you were nervous, Monsieur Dubois. Your hands, they dance like leaves in the wind. Your eyes, they seek the windows as if the snow holds answers. Is there something you have not told me?" Pierre's jaw tightened, and he shook his head. "I have told you all I know, Monsieur Poirot. I am a conductor, not a detective. I saw..." The figure, I heard the bell, and I found nothing amiss until the body was discovered. Poirot leaned forward, his voice gentle but insistent. Let us reconstruct the night, Monsieur Dubois, step by step, moment by moment. You were at your post at the end of the first-class carriage, yes? The train had stopped, the snowdrift rendering us immobile. The passengers were in their compartments, or so you believed. At 12:30, the bell rings from compartment 7. You go, you knock, you receive no answer, you return to your post. Then, 10 minutes later, you see this cloaked figure. Where were you standing, precisely, when you saw them? Pierre frowned, as if trying to summon the memory. I was near the service door, monsieur, at the junction between the first-class carriage and the dining car. The figure came from the direction of the compartments and moved past me toward the rear. And the lighting, Poirot pressed. You say it was dim. But the Silver Crescent Express is a train of luxury. Surely there are lamps, even at night, but they are dimmed after midnight to allow the passengers to sleep. The corridor lights are low, casting shadows. It was enough to see the figure, but not to discern details. Poirot nodded, his mind cataloguing the information. The conductor's story was plausible, yet it lacked the solidity of truth. The nervous gestures, the quick answers, they suggested a man with something to hide, or perhaps a man afraid of what he did not understand. Poirot decided to shift his approach, to test the conductor's reactions from another angle. Monsieur Dubois, he said, his tone conversational, you have worked on this train for how long? 5 years, Monsieur Pierre replied, his voice steadier now that the question seemed innocuous. I began as a junior conductor and was promoted to first-class service 2 years ago. A position of trust, Poirot noted. You see, hear much. The passengers, they confide in you, perhaps, or you overhear their conversations, their secrets. Pierre's lips pressed into a thin line. I am discreet, monsieur. I do not eavesdrop. My role is to ensure their comfort, not to pry into their affairs. And yet, Poirot said, his eyes gleaming, you cannot help but notice things. A glance, a whisper, a tension in the air. Tell me, what was the mood in the dining car during dinner, before the train stopped? Pierre hesitated, then shrugged. It was, as usual, monsieur. The passengers were lively, some more than others. Monsieur Langston was forceful. He spoke loudly, dominated the conversation. Madame Dubois, the actress, seemed displeased with him. There was an argument, brief, but sharp. The others, Miss Thornton, Monsieur Blake, Colonel Warwick, they were quieter, but there was a tension, yes. Poirot's pencil moved again, noting the confirmation of the argument he had already learned of from Madame Dubois. And after dinner, did you see Monsieur Langston return to his compartment? Oui, monsieur. He retired shortly after 10. I believe he requested a brandy, which I delivered to his compartment. That was the last I saw of him, and the other passengers. Poirot asked, where did they go after dinner? Pierre thought for a moment. Miss Thornton and Monsieur Blake went to the lounge car for a time, then to their compartments. Madame Dubois retired early, as did Miss Holt and Count Olave. Colonel Warwick spent some time in the smoking lounge before returning to his compartment. Poirot's mind worked swiftly, piecing together the timeline. Langston was last seen alive at 10, and the bell rang at 12:30. 2.5 hours, a window in which the murder occurred. The locked compartment, the absence of footprints in the snow outside, and now this cloaked figure was a puzzle with many pieces. and Pierre Dubois was one of them. "Let us speak of your duties," Poirot said, changing tack again. "You are responsible for the first-class carriage. You check tickets, deliver refreshments, answer bells. You have a routine, yes. Did anything about Monsieur Langston's behavior strike you as unusual?" Pierre shook his head. "He was a demanding passenger, monsieur. He requested extra pillows, specific brands of brandy, and privacy, but nothing out of the ordinary for a man of his wealth." "And his secretary, Mademoiselle Evans?" Poirot asked. "She was often with him, Nan. Oui, she brought him documents, attended to his needs. She was in his compartment at 9, delivering papers, as she said." Poirot nodded, his mind recalling Clara Evans's nervous demeanor during her own interview. "And after 9, did you see her again?" "Not that I recall, monsieur. She returned to her compartment, I believe." Poirot's pencil tapped lightly against the notepad. "Let us return to the cloaked figure. You say they moved toward the rear of the carriage. Did you hear a door open, perhaps to the next carriage, or the sound of a compartment locking?" Pierre shook his head. "No, monsieur. The train was quiet. I heard only the wind outside and the creaking of the carriage." Poirot leaned back, his mind racing. The conductor's story was consistent, but his very consistency raised suspicion. A man as observant as Pierre should have noticed more a detail of the cloak, a sound, a scent. The absence of such details suggested either remarkable inattention or deliberate omission. Poirot decided to press further, to see if he could unsettle the conductor's composure. "Monsieur Dubois," he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "you are aware that a man has been murdered. 12 stab wounds, a locked compartment, a train stranded in the snow. The killer is among us, and you, as conductor, are in a unique position. You see all, you hear all. If there is something you are withholding, now is the time to speak." Pierre's face paled further, and his hands clenched into fists. "I have told you everything, Monsieur Poirot. I swear it. I saw the figure. I heard the bell, and I found nothing until the body was discovered. I am no murderer." Poirot studied him for a long moment, his green eyes piercing. "Very well," he said at last. "You may return to your duties, Monsieur Dubois, but I will speak with you again. The truth, it has a way of revealing itself, and I, Hercule Poirot, am its faithful servant." Pierre nodded, his relief palpable, and exited the dining car with a haste that did not go unnoticed. Poirot remained at the table, his pencil tracing idle circles on the notepad as his mind worked. The conductor's story was a thread in the tapestry of the crime, but it was frayed, incomplete. The cloaked figure, the unanswered bell, the nervous demeanor, they pointed to something more, something hidden. Poirot's little grey cells buzzed with activity, piecing together the fragments of the night. He rose and paced the dining car, his polished shoes silent on the thick carpet. The other passengers would need to be questioned again, their alibis tested, their motives uncovered. Clara Evans, with her access to Langston's compartment. Madame Dubois, with her grudge over a failed investment. Colonel Warwick, with his military pride wounded by Langston's past. Emily Thornton and Julian Blake, whose perfect alibi seemed too perfect. Miss Holt, quiet but perhaps not as innocent as she appeared. And Count Orlov, whose diplomatic status was yet to be verified. And now Pierre Dubois, whose nervous hands and evasive eyes suggested a man caught in a web he did not fully understand. Poirot paused by the window, staring out at the snow that continued to fall, blanketing the train in silence. The Silver Crescent. Express was a microcosm of secrets, each passenger a potential thread in the murderer's design. The torn letter fragment with the word vengeance, the monogrammed handkerchief with the initial E, the 12 stab wounds they were. Clues, yes, but also distractions. The truth lay deeper in the motives and histories of those aboard. As he returned to his seat, Poirot's mind turned to the timeline. The bell at 12:30, the cloaked figure at 12:40, the discovery of the body shortly after, the locked compartment, ruled out an outsider, and the absence of footprints in the snow confirmed it. The killer was on the train, and Pierre's testimony, flawed though it was, provided a starting point. The conductor had seen something or someone, and his reluctance to share more suggested fear, guilt, or perhaps loyalty to another. Poirot opened his notepad and began to sketch a timeline, marking the known events: Langston's last sighting at 10, Clara's visit at 9, the bell at 12:30, the cloaked figure at 12:40. He added a question mark for the murder itself, somewhere between 10 and 1. The window was narrow, but the possibilities were vast. A single killer, acting alone, or a conspiracy, as the 12 wounds might suggest, each stab a contribution from a different hand. He closed the notepad and stood, adjusting his tie with a precise flick of his fingers. The dining car was empty now, the other passengers in their compartments, perhaps whispering their own secrets. Poirot's task was clear: to unravel the threads, to find the pattern in the chaos. Pierre Dubois was a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture. The truth, as he had told the conductor, would reveal itself, and Hercule Poirot would be there to meet it. The snow continued to fall outside, and the Silver Crescent Express remained still, a frozen stage for a murder most foul. Poirot stepped into the corridor, his mind already turning to the next interview, the next clue. The conductor's account was a beginning, not an end, and the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot were only just warming to their task. Chapter 6. A hidden past. The Silver Crescent Express remained immobilized in the snow, its opulent interiors now suffused with a chilling undercurrent of suspicion. Hercule Poirot, his mind as sharp as the frost clinging to the train's windows, sat in the dining car, now his makeshift office. The polished mahogany table before him was strewn with note-scribbled observations, timelines, and fragments of conversations. His small, meticulous handwriting filled the pages, each line a step toward unraveling the tangled web of Victor Langston's murder. The torn letter fragment with the word vengeance lay at the center of his thoughts, its implications as heavy as the snow outside. The dining car was quiet now, the other passengers confined to their compartments under the conductor's watchful eye. Pierre Dubois, the conductor, had been instructed to ensure no one wandered, though Poirot suspected the man's own nervousness might prove a liability. The scream that had pierced the night still echoed in Poirot's memory, a stark reminder that the killer or killers remained aboard, their motives cloaked in the shadows of their pasts. Poirot's grey cells were alight with questions. The letter fragment suggested a motive rooted in retribution, but for what? Langston, a man of wealth and influence, had undoubtedly made enemies, but the ferocity of 12 stab wounds hinted at something deeply personal. The monogrammed handkerchief with the initial E was another puzzle. Millie Thornton or Madame Dubois Elise, as Poirot had learned. Or was it a deliberate misdirection planted to obscure the truth? And then there was the conductor's account of a cloaked figure in the corridor, a fleeting shadow that could belong to anyone nor no one. Poirot adjusted his spectacles and turned to Clara Evans, the industrialist's secretary, who sat across from him. Her pale face was drawn, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had agreed to this second interview, though her reluctance was palpable. Poirot's first questioning in the dining car had yielded little beyond her claim of delivering documents to Langston at 9 p.m. Now, with the train stranded and the stakes higher, Poirot intended to press deeper. "Mademoiselle Evans," he began, his voice calm but firm, "you have told me you were employed by Monsieur Langston for 3 years. A loyal secretary, yet I sense there is more to your story. A man like Langston, powerful, ruthless, must have left a trail of grievances. Tell me, what do you know of his past?" Clara's eyes darted to the window, where the snow continued to fall in silent, relentless sheets. I don't know what you mean, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Langston was a businessman. He had competitors, of course, but nothing out of the ordinary." Poirot leaned forward, his moustache twitching slightly. "Mademoiselle, let us dispense with the ordinary. A man has been murdered, stabbed 12 times in a locked compartment. This is not the work of a competitor settling a business dispute. This is personal. You were his secretary. You saw his correspondence, his dealings. Did he ever speak of the Harcourts?" Clara's fingers tightened, her knuckles whitening. "The Harcourts," she echoed, her voice catching. Why would you ask about them?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. He had struck a nerve. "Because, mademoiselle, I have reason to believe that Victor Langston's past is the key to his death. The word vengeance on that torn letter suggests a motive rooted in history. The Harcourts, I understand, were a family ruined by Langston's actions. Their daughter, Lily Harcourt, died under tragic circumstances. Surely you, as his confidant, know something of this." Clara's gaze dropped to her hands. For a long moment she was silent, the only sound the faint creaking of the train as it settled in the snow. When she spoke, her voice was low, almost confessional. I heard rumors. Years ago, before I worked for him, Mr. Langston was involved in a business deal that went wrong. A company he controlled bought out a smaller firm owned by the Harcourt family. The deal was not entirely above board. There were accusations of fraud, of doctored accounts. The Harcourts lost everything, their wealth, their reputation. And then Lily, their only daughter, died. Poirot's expression remained impassive, but his mind was racing. And how did Mademoiselle Lily die? Clara hesitated, her eyes flickering with something like fear. They said it was an accident. She fell from a balcony at their estate, but there were whispers that it wasn't an accident at all, that she was driven to despair after the family's ruin. Some even said, she paused, swallowing hard. Some said she was pushed. Poirot leaned back, his fingers steepled. Pushed? By whom? No one was ever charged, Clara said quickly. It was just gossip. The Harcourts were devastated. They left England, disappeared from society. I don't know where they went. And yet, Poirot said softly, the word vengeance suggests that someone has not forgotten. Someone, perhaps, who blames Monsieur Langston for Lily's death. Tell me, mademoiselle, did Langston ever receive threats? Letters, perhaps? From the Harcourts or their allies? Clara shook her head, but her eyes betrayed her. Not that I saw he was a private man. He didn't share such things with me. Poirot's smile was thin. You are loyal, mademoiselle, but loyalty can obscure the truth. If you know more, I urge you to speak. The murderer is among us, and silence will not protect you. Clara's lips parted, but no words came. She rose abruptly, smoothing her skirt. I have told you all I know, Monsieur Poirot. May I go? Poirot inclined his head. For now, mademoiselle, but we will speak again. As Clara left, Poirot turned to his notes, adding a single line. Clara Evans knows more of the Harcourts than she admits. The secretary's reaction had confirmed his suspicions. The Harcourt scandal was no mere footnote in Langton's life. It was a wound that had festered, perhaps for years, until it culminated in murder. But who among the passengers was connected to the Harcourts? And how? Poirot's next task was to probe the backgrounds of the others. He summoned Pierre, the conductor, to fetch Emily Thornton, the young heiress whose monogrammed handkerchief, or one suspiciously like it, had been found in Langton's hand. Emily entered the dining car with an air of poised defiance, her auburn hair gleaming under the chandelier's light. She wore a deep green dress, elegant yet understated, and her blue eyes met Poirot's with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Mademoiselle Thornton, Poirot began, gesturing to a chair. You are aware of the handkerchief found in Monsieur. Investigate Monsieur Langton's compartment. It bears the initial E. I understand your name is Emily. Can you explain this? Emily's expression remained composed, though her fingers tightened slightly on her handbag. I'm afraid I can't, Monsieur Poirot, she said smoothly. It's not my handkerchief. E is a common initial. It could belong to anyone nor no one. Perhaps it was already in the compartment. Poirot tilted his head, studying her. A possibility, mademoiselle, but let us explore another. You are a woman of means, yes. Your family, the Thorntons, are well known in London society. Tell me, do you have any connection to the Harcourt family? Emily's eyes widened slightly, but she recovered quickly. The Harcourts, I've heard the name, of course. A tragic story, from what I understand, but I have no direct connection to them. My family's wealth comes from shipping, not from any dealings with Langton or his businesses. Poirot noted the careful wording, no direct connection, and yet, he said, the Harcourt scandal was widely discussed. Surely you have heard of Victor Langton's role in their ruin. Emily's smile was tight. Gossip travels, Monsieur Poirot. I know of Langton's reputation, but it has no bearing on me. I barely knew the man. Yet you dined with him last night, Poirot pressed. I observed you speaking with him, and there seemed to be familiarity. We spoke briefly, Emily said, her tone cool. He was a prominent man, and I am an heiress. People like him often seek my acquaintance. It means nothing, Poirot. Let the matter drop, but his suspicions deepened. Emily's composure was admirable, but her answers were too polished, too rehearsed. He made a mental note to investigate her family's history further. The Thorntons were wealthy, but wealth could mask secrets, and the Harcourt name had elicited a flicker of recognition in her eyes. Next, Poirot called for Madame Isabelle Dubois, the actress whose real name, Elise, also matched the handkerchief's initial. She swept into the dining car with the grace of a stage performer, her silk gown rustling softly. Her dark eyes were guarded, her smile practiced. Madame Dubois, Poirot said, or should I say, Mademoiselle Elise, the handkerchief in Langton's compartment could be yours, Nan. Madame Dubois laughed, a low, melodic sound. Oh, Monsieur Poirot, you are thorough. Yes, Elise is my given name, but I assure you that handkerchief is not mine. I have several, of course fans send such trinkets, but I keep mine in my luggage, not in a dead man's hand. And your argument with Monsieur Langston last night? Poirot asked. It seemed heated. A business deal gone wrong, perhaps. Her smile faltered. A misunderstanding, she said. Langston invested in a production of mine that failed. I lost a great deal of money tied to my family's fortunes. But I am a professional, monsieur. I do not stab men over financial disputes. Poirot raised an eyebrow. And the Harcourts, did your family's fortunes intersect with theirs? Madame Dubois's expression hardened. The Harcourts were before my time in England. I know of them only through society gossip. Their ruin was a scandal, but it has nothing to do with me. Poirot dismissed her, unconvinced. Her evasiveness mirrored Clara's, and the coincidence of two E monograms was too convenient. He suspected the handkerchief was a red herring, meant to cast suspicion on Emily or Elise, but by whom? The day wore on, and Poirot interviewed the remaining passengers. Colonel Henry Warwick, gruff and defensive, admitted to knowing the Harcourts through his brother, who had been their financial advisor. Langston's dealings destroyed my brother's career, Warwick said, his voice bitter. But I'm no murderer. I was in the smoking lounge when he died. Miss Agnes Holt, the governess, was surprisingly reticent. When pressed about the Harcourts, she admitted to having worked for a family in England years ago, but claimed it was unrelated. I was asleep when it happened, she insisted, her voice trembling. Count Vladimir Orlov, the mysterious diplomat, was the most elusive. His papers, Poirot had discovered, were forged, and he admitted to being Ivan Petrov, a private investigator. I was hired to follow Langston, Petrov said. My client suspected him of fraud, but they didn't tell me why. I saw Clara near his compartment at midnight, but I didn't kill him. As night fell, Poirot sat alone in the dining car, the train's stillness amplifying his thoughts. The Harcourt scandal was the thread connecting the passengers. Clara's knowledge, Emily's possible family ties, Madame Dubois's financial loss, Warwick's brother Holt's vague past, Petrov's mission, all pointed to a shared grievance. The letter fragment, the handkerchief, the cloaked figure, the midnight bell, they were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture was still incomplete. Poirot's mind turned to the 12 stab wounds. A single killer might hesitate, leaving shallow wounds, but the number suggested something ritualistic, collective. Could it be that the passengers, bound by their hatred of Langston, had conspired, each with a motive, each with a blade? The thought was audacious, but Poirot's little grey cells thrived on such complexities. He rose, adjusting his coat. Tomorrow he would test his theory, probing deeper into the passengers' alibis and connections. For now, the snow continued to fall, sealing the Silver Crescent Express in its icy prison, and the truth, like the train, remained just out of reach. Chapter 7. The handkerchief Cluth, Silver Crescent Express remained stranded in the snow-swept mountains, its opulent interiors now a stage for suspicion and secrets. Hercule Poirot sat in the dining car, his small, precise hands folded neatly on the table, his moustache twitching as he contemplated the monogrammed handkerchief found clutched in Victor Langston's lifeless hand. The initial E, embroidered in delicate silk thread, was a beacon in the fog of the investigation, pointing to a possible culprit, a deliberate misdirection. The little Belgian detective's grey cells were alight, piecing together the puzzle of the murdered industrialist, whose body lay in the locked compartment just a few cars away. The dining car, with its polished mahogany paneling and crystal chandeliers, was quieter now than it had been during the elegant dinner service the previous evening. The passengers, once animated with conversation and clinking glasses, now sat in uneasy silence, their eyes darting to one another as Poirot prepared to delve deeper into the mystery. The handkerchief was the first tangible clue, and its significance could not be overstated. Was it a careless mistake by the murderer, or a cunning attempt to cast suspicion on another? Poirot's first task was to confront Emily Thornton, the young heiress whose initial matched the handkerchief's monogram. He found her seated near the window, her delicate frame wrapped in a fur-trimmed shawl, her green eyes fixed on the endless snow outside. Her fiancé Julian Blake hovered nearby, his charming smile replaced by a tense frown. Poirot approached. With his characteristic courtesy, his voice soft but commanding attention. "Mademoiselle Thornton," he began, holding up the handkerchief, carefully preserved in a small evidence envelope provided by the conductor, Pierre Dubois. "This was found in the hand of Monsieur Langston. The initial E is most intriguing, Nan. It could, perhaps, belong to you." Emily's head snapped toward him, her pale cheeks flushing. "Me? Why, that's absurd," she exclaimed, her voice trembling slightly. "I've never seen that handkerchief before in my life. E is a common initial, Monsieur Poirot. It could belong to anyone." Poirot tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as he studied her reaction. "Indeed, mademoiselle, it is common, but in a train carriage with so few passengers, the coincidence is, how you say, striking. You are certain you do not recognize it?" "Quite certain," Emily replied, her tone firm but her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Julian stepped forward, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "See here, Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice carrying the polished edge of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Emily has no reason to be involved in this ghastly business. She was with me all evening, as I've already told you. This handkerchief must belong to someone else." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his gaze lingering on Julian's hand, which tightened briefly on Emily's shoulder. "Mercy, Monsieur Blake. Your loyalty to Mademoiselle Thornton is admirable, but the truth, it has a way of revealing itself, no matter how well it is guarded." Leaving the couple to their uneasy whispers, Poirot turned his attention to another passenger whose name bore the initial E, Madame Isabelle Dubois, the glamorous actress whose presence on the train had caused a stir among the other passengers. She was seated at a table near the bar, sipping a glass of champagne as if the murder were a mere inconvenience to her carefully curated life. Her crimson gown shimmered under the chandelier's light, and her dark hair was swept into an elegant chignon. But Poirot, with his keen eye for detail, noticed the faintest tremor in her hand as she set the glass down. "Madame Dubois," Poirot said, approaching her table with a polite bow. "A moment of your time, s'il vous plaît. This handkerchief, with the initial E, was found at the scene of the crime. I understand your given name is Elise. Perhaps it belongs to you." Madame Dubois's laughter was light, almost musical, but it carried an edge of nervousness. "Elise, oh, Monsieur Poirot, how quaint of you to remember my real name. Most people know me only as Isabelle." She leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with a practiced charm. "But I assure you, I have no such handkerchief. My linens are far more distinctive. Besides, I was nowhere near Langston's compartment last night. I retired early after that dreadful argument with him." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "The argument, madame, I mentioned it briefly before, but perhaps you could elaborate." It seems Monsieur Langston had a talent for making enemies. Madame Dubois waved a dismissive hand, her diamond bracelet catching the light. Oh, it was nothing serious. A business disagreement, that's all. Victor had promised to invest in my next film, but he backed out at the last moment. I was disappointed, naturally, but I didn't kill him over it. Naturellement, Poirot said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. And yet, the handkerchief with the E is most curious. If it is not yours, and not Mademoiselle Thornton's, then perhaps it was placed there to mislead. But by whom, and why? Madame Dubois's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered quickly. I wouldn't know, monsieur. Poirot, perhaps you should ask the others. That quiet governess, Miss Holt, for instance. She's been awfully silent through all this. Poirot made a mental note of her deflection, but said nothing, merely offering a polite nod before excusing himself. The actress's composure was impressive, but her quick attempt to shift suspicion to another passenger intrigued him. Was she hiding something, or simply eager to distance herself from the crime? The next step was to examine Madame Dubois's belongings. With the conductor's permission, Poirot and Dr. Franz Müller, the physician who had assisted at the crime scene, conducted a discreet search of the passenger's luggage. In Madame Dubois's elegantly packed suitcase, tucked between silk scarves and velvet gloves, Poirot found a handkerchief that matched the one from Langston's compartment. The fabric was identical, and the monogrammed E was stitched. In the same delicate script, Mon Dieu, Poirot murmured, holding the two handkerchiefs side by side. The plot, it thickens. He returned to the dining car and requested Madame Dubois's presence once more. This time, her expression was less confident as he presented the second handkerchief. Madame, this was found among your possessions. It is identical to the one in Monsieur Langston's hand. How do you explain this? Madame Dubois's eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed genuinely taken aback. That's impossible, she exclaimed. I told you, I don't own such a handkerchief. Someone must have planted it in my luggage. This is a setup, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot studied her closely, his mind racing. Her shock appeared genuine, but he had seen many a skilled performer in his time. A setup, you say? And who would wish to implicate you, madame? Who among these passengers has reason to cast suspicion upon you? I don't know, she stammered, her composure slipping. But I swear I had nothing to do with Langston's death. You must believe. Me, I believe only in the facts, Madame Poirot replied gently. And the facts, they tell a story that is not yet complete. As Madame Dubois returned to her seat, visibly shaken, Poirot turned his attention to the other passengers. The handkerchief clue had opened a Pandora's box of possibilities. If it was indeed planted, as Madame Dubois claimed, then the murderer was playing a clever game, sowing confusion to obscure their own guilt. But if it belonged to either Emily or Madame Dubois, then one of them was lying, and perhaps more than one. Poirot's next move was to revisit Emily Thornton. He found her alone in the observation car, staring out at the snow-covered mountains. The dim light cast shadows across her face, accentuating her delicate features and the faint worry lines that had begun to form. Mademoiselle, Poirot said softly, taking a seat across from her. I must ask you again about the handkerchief. Another has been found, identical to the first, in Madame Dubois's luggage. Yet both of you deny ownership. Tell me, is there anything at all that you have not shared with Poirot? Emily's eyes met his, and for a moment he thought she might confess something. But she shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've told you everything, Monsieur Poirot. I don't know who killed Mr. Langston, and I don't know anything about that handkerchief." Poirot leaned back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Very well, mademoiselle. But know this, the truth, it cannot hide forever. It is like the snow outside eventually. It melts, and all is revealed." Leaving Emily to her thoughts, Poirot decided to broaden his inquiry. The handkerchief was a clue, yes, but it was not the only one. The torn letter fragment with the word vengeance still lingered in his mind, as did the Harcourt scandal Clara Evans had mentioned. If the handkerchief was a misdirection, then perhaps the letter was the key to unlocking the motive behind Langston's murder. He sought out Clara, the nervous secretary, who was sitting alone in a corner of the dining car, her hands clasped tightly around a cup of tea. Her plain grey dress and severe bun gave her an air of invisibility. But Poirot knew better than to underestimate anyone in this investigation. "Mademoiselle Evans," he said, taking a seat opposite her, "you spoke of Monsieur Langston's involvement in the Harcourt scandal. Tell me more. Who were the Harcourts, and why did their ruin inspire such a word as vengeance?" Clara hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting someone to overhear. It's not my place to speak of it, Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly. "Mr. Langston was my employer. I only know what I overheard. The Harcourts were a wealthy family, ruined by a bad investment in one of Mr. Langston's companies. There were rumours of fraud, and their daughter, Lily, died shortly after. They say she took her own life, but some believed it was more complicated." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Complicated, you say? And who among our passengers might have a connection to this tragedy?" Clara shook her head. "I don't know. I swear I don't. But Mr. Langston received threatening letters, sometimes anonymous ones. He laughed them off, but I always thought they sounded serious." Poirot nodded, filing this information away. The Harcourt scandal was a thread that seemed to weave through the lives of multiple passengers. Could the handkerchief, with its incriminating E, be tied to this vendetta? And if so, who was the true owner or the true planter of the clue? As the day wore on, Poirot continued his interviews, observing each passenger's reactions to the handkerchief clue. Colonel Warwick, the gruff, retired military man, scoffed at the idea of a handkerchief being significant, insisting it was woman's nonsense and that the real clue lay in the brutality of the murder itself. Miss Agnes Holt, the quiet governess, seemed startled when shown the handkerchief, but claimed ignorance, her hands trembling as she adjusted her spectacles. Count Vladimir Orlov, the mysterious diplomat, merely raised an eyebrow and remarked that such a common item could belong to anyone by evening. The dining car was abuzz with tension. The passengers, aware that Poirot was closing in on the truth, grew increasingly guarded. Poirot, however, was undeterred. He stood at the centre of the room, addressing the group as a whole. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had solved countless mysteries. "The handkerchief with the initial E is a puzzle within. A puzzle? It may belong to one of you, or it may have been placed to deceive. But rest assured, Hercule Poirot will uncover the truth. The murderer is among us, and no clue, however small, will escape my notice." As he spoke, his eyes scanned the faces before him: Emily's pale determination, Julian's forced calm, Madame Dubois's defiant elegance, Colonel Watt's stern resolve, Miss Holt's quiet fear, Count Orloff's enigmatic smirk, and Clara's anxious fidgeting. The answer was there, hidden in their expressions, their secrets, their lies. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the train in. Silence. But within the Silver Crescent Express, the storm of suspicion was only beginning to gather strength. Poirot knew that the handkerchief was merely the first thread to unravel. The next clue, the midnight bell, perhaps, or the mysterious figure in the dark cloak, would bring him closer to the heart of the mystery. For now, he retired to his compartment, his mind a whirlwind of possibilities, determined to solve the murder before the train reached Vienna or before the killer struck. Again. Chapter 8. The Midnight Belve, the Silver Crescent Express, lay motionless in the snowy embrace of the mountains, its gleaming exterior now a ghostly silhouette against the moonlit drifts. Inside, the air was thick with unease, the passengers restless, as the reality of Victor Langston's murder settled over them like a shroud. Hercule Poirot, his sharp eyes glinting in the dim light of the dining car, sat at a table now serving as his makeshift investigation headquarters. The faint clink of crystal and silver from earlier dinners had been replaced by the weighty silence of suspicion. Poirot's mind was a whirl of details, each piece of evidence a thread in the intricate tapestry of the crime. The monogrammed handkerchief, with the initial E, the torn letter fragment bearing the word vengeance, the 12 stab wounds, some shallow, some deep, all pointed to a puzzle that was as much about human motives as it was about physical clues. But now a new detail had emerged, one that tugged at his intuition like a persistent bell in the night. The account of Mrs. Margaret Lyle, an elderly passenger who claimed to have seen a man in her compartment shortly before the murder. Mrs. Lyle, a frail woman with a penchant for dramatic flair, had rung her bell repeatedly at approximately 12:40 a.m., insisting that a shadowy figure had entered her compartment. The conductor, Pierre Dubois, had dismissed her claim as the product of a nightmare. But Poirot was not so quick to discard her story. Nightmares, he knew, could sometimes be the mind's way of interpreting truths too unsettling to face in the waking world. He rose from his seat, adjusting his meticulously pressed suit, and made his way to Mrs. Lyle's compartment, accompanied by Dr. Franz Müller, who had proven himself a useful, if overly pedantic, ally in examining the crime scene. The corridor was narrow, the walls panelled in rich mahogany that gleamed under the soft glow of the train's lamps. The air was chilly, the heating system struggling against the relentless cold outside. Mrs. Lyle's compartment was modest compared to the opulent suites of the first-class passengers, but it was tidy, with a small embroidered shawl draped over the armchair and a stack of well-worn novels on the bedside table. The elderly woman sat upright in her bed, her white hair neatly braided, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and indignation. She clutched a lace handkerchief, which she waved like a flag of surrender as Poirot entered. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, her voice tremulous but laced with determination, "I assure you, I am not a woman prone to fancies. I know what I saw. A mantle, dark, sinister, standing at the foot of my bed. I rang the bell at once, but that useless conductor did nothing but tell me I was dreaming." Poirot inclined his head, his moustache twitching slightly as he considered her words. "Madame Lyle, your account is of great interest to me. Please, describe this man in as much detail as you can recall. Every particular, no matter how small, may be significant." Mrs. Lyle pursed her lips, her eyes narrowing as she summoned the memory. "It was dark, you understand, and the light from the corridor was faint. But he was tall, I'm certain of it. He wore a dark coat, perhaps a cloak, and his face. Oh, I couldn't see his face clearly, but there was something menacing about him. He stood there for only a moment, then vanished when I screamed and rang the bell. Poirot nodded, his fingers steepled before him. And you say this was at approximately 12:40 a.m. You are certain of the time? As certain as I am of my own name, she replied firmly. I glanced at my little travel clock just after I rang the bell. It was exactly 12:40. Thank you, madame. Your precision is most helpful. Poirot's gaze swept the compartment, taking in every detail. The bed was neatly made, save for the slight rumple where Mrs. Lyle had been lying. The window was firmly shut, the latch secure, and the snow outside undisturbed. There was no sign of forced entry, no trace of an intruder, except for one small detail that caught Poirot's eye. On the floor, near the foot of the bed, lay a single, polished button. It was small, brass, with a subtle crest etched into its surface, a military design, perhaps, or one belonging to a tailored coat. Bent down, careful not to touch it, and examined it closely. The crest was familiar, though he could not immediately place it. He signalled to Dr. Muller, who produced a small envelope from his medical bag, and Poirot carefully lifted the button with a pair of tweezers, placing it inside. This button, Madame Lyle, Poirot said, holding up the envelope. Did you notice it before this incident? Mrs. Lyle shook her head. No, Monsieur Poirot. I keep my compartment spotless. That button was not there when I retired for the night. Poirot's mind raced. A button, such a small thing, yet potentially a key to unlocking the mystery. It suggested a struggle, or at least a moment of carelessness, by someone who had been in this compartment or nearby. He thanked Mrs. Lyle and promised to keep her informed, though he sensed she was more eager for gossip than for justice. Returning to the dining car, Poirot summoned Pierre Dubois, the conductor, whose nervous demeanour had already piqued his suspicion. Pierre arrived promptly, his uniform immaculate, but his eyes darting about as if searching for an escape. Monsieur Dubois, Poirot began, his voice calm but commanding. You were summoned by Madame Lyle's bell at 12:40 a.m., yes? Pierre nodded, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow despite the chill. Yes, Monsieur Poirot. She was quite agitated, claiming she saw a man. I checked her compartment, but there was no one there. I thought perhaps she had a bad dream. And you saw nothing unusual in the corridor? Poirot pressed, his eyes fixed on Pierre's face. Pierre hesitated, his fingers twitching at his side. Well, I did see someone, but only briefly. A figure in a dark cloak, moving quickly down the corridor toward the first-class carriages. I couldn't see who it was too dark, and they were gone before I could follow. Poirot leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. And this figure, Monsieur Dubois, did they come from the direction of Monsieur Langston's compartment? Pierre swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I cannot say for certain. It was all so quick. But yes, it could have been from that direction. Poirot sat back, his mind assembling the timeline. Langston's bell had rung at 12:30 a.m., according to Pierre, but no one was found when he checked. 10 minutes later, Mrs. Lyle's bell rang, and she reported a man in her compartment. A figure in a dark cloak was seen in the corridor, possibly fleeing from Langston's compartment. And now, a button perhaps from the very coat or cloak in question had been found. The pieces were beginning to align, but the picture they formed was still maddeningly incomplete. He dismissed Pierre, noting the conductor's relief as he hurried away, and turned his attention to the button. Its crest was distinctive, and Poirot's memory, sharp as ever, began to connect it to something he had seen earlier. During his interviews in the dining car, he had noticed Colonel Henry Warwick's coat, a finely tailored garment with brass buttons bearing a similar crest. Could it be a coincidence? Poirot did not believe in coincidences, not in a case as tangled as this. He decided to confront the colonel, but first he needed to verify the button's origin. He made his way to the luggage car, where the passengers' belongings were stored, and requested access to Colonel Warwick's trunk. The porter, a young man named Jacques, complied, though his hands trembled slightly as he unlocked the car. The colonel's trunk was heavy, filled with military memorabilia and neatly pressed uniforms. Poirot examined the coat he had seen Warwick wearing, a dark wool garment with a row of brass buttons. One was missing, and the remaining buttons bore the same crest as the one found in Mrs. Lyle's compartment. The match was unmistakable. Poirot returned to the dining car, where Colonel Warwick was nursing a glass of brandy, his face set in a scowl. The other passengers had dispersed to their compartments, leaving the dining car eerily quiet. Poirot approached the colonel, the envelope containing the button held lightly in his hand. "Colonel Warwick," he said, his tone polite but firm, "may I have a word?" Warwick looked up, his eyes narrowing. "What is it now, Poirot? I've told you everything I know." Poirot held up the envelope. "This button, Colonel, was found in Madame Lyle's compartment, where she claims to have seen an intruder at 12:40 a.m. It matches the buttons on your coat, one of which, I have observed, is missing. Would you care to explain?" Warwick's face paled, but he quickly recovered, his military bearing asserting itself. "That's absurd. I lost a button earlier today, probably in the smoking lounge. Anyone could have picked it up and dropped it in her compartment." "You're grasping at straws, Poirot." Poirot's moustache twitched, a sign of his amusement at Warwick's bluster. "Perhaps, Colonel, but you will admit it is curious that you were in the corridor near the time of the murder, looking for this very button, were you not?" Warwick's jaw tightened. "I told you I was in the smoking lounge most of the evening. I noticed the button was missing when I returned to my compartment around midnight. I went back to look for it, but I didn't go near Langston's compartment. And I certainly didn't enter that old woman's bed. And yet," Poirot said, his voice soft but piercing, "the button was found where an intruder was reported. And you have admitted to a dislike for Monsieur Langston, due to a past scandal involving your brother, I believe." Warwick's hand tightened around his glass, and for a moment Poirot thought he might hurl it across the room. Instead, he set it down with deliberate care. "My brother was ruined by Langston's schemes, yes, but I'm no murderer, Poirot. If I wanted Langston dead, I'd have challenged him to a duel, not skulked about in the night like a coward." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "A duel, you say? A most honourable solution. But murder, Colonel, is rarely honourable. Tell me, did you see anyone else in the corridor when you were searching for your button?" Warwick hesitated, his eyes flickering with something Poirot couldn't quite place, fear, perhaps, or calculation. "I saw the conductor Dubois near Langston's compartment, and I thought I saw someone else, a figure in a dark cloak, but it was too quick to be sure." Poirot's mind seized on this. Another mention of a dark cloak, echoing Pierre's account. Was it a coincidence, or was someone deliberately creating confusion? He thanked Warwick and dismissed him, his thoughts turning to the other passengers. The handkerchief with the initial E had pointed to Emily Thornton and Madame Dubois, but neither had a clear connection to the button or the cloak. Count Orloff, with his mysterious demeanour, was a possibility, as was Julian Blake, whose charming exterior might hide a darker purpose. Even Miss Holt, the timid governess, could not be ruled out. Her quietness might conceal a deeper involvement. As the night deepened, Poirot returned to his own compartment, his mind a whirlwind of possibilities. The midnight bell, rung by Mrs. Lyle, had been a distraction. He was certain of it. But a distraction for whom? The murderer, slipping away from Langston's compartment, or a group of conspirators working together to ensure their plan succeeded? The button, the cloak, the torn letterall were pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit neatly together. He sat at his small desk, pulling out his notebook and jotting down the timeline once more. 12:30 a.m. Langston's bell rings. Pierre finds no one. 12:40 a.m. Mrs. Lyle's bell rings. She reports an intruder. 12:40 a.m. Approx. Pierre sees a figure in a dark cloak in the corridor. 12:45 a.m. Approx. Langston is found dead, stabbed 12 times. The button, Poirot decided, was the key. It placed Colonel Warricourt, someone, wearing his coat near the scene of the crime. But the cloak suggested another layer of deception, a disguise meant to obscure the killer's identity. And the 12 stab wounds. They spoke of rage, of vengeance, but also of hesitation. Why 12? Why not one clean strike? The answer, Poirot suspected, lay in the number itself, a symbolic act, perhaps, tied to the Harcourt scandal that Clara had mentioned. He closed his notebook, his eyes drifting to the window where the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in silence. The Silver Crescent Express was a microcosm of secrets, each passenger carrying their own burdens of guilt, anger, or fear. Poirot knew he was close to unravelling the truth, but the final piece eluded him. The midnight bell had rung, and with it, the murderer had moved. But who had pulled the cord, and who had slipped into the shadows? As he prepared to retire for the night, Poirot's thoughts turned to the passengers' connections to the Harcourts. Clara's mention of the family's ruin, Warwick's brother, Emily's distant relation, each thread led back to that long-ago scandal. Was it possible that the murder was not the work of one person, but of many? A collective act of retribution, orchestrated in the confines of this stranded train? He shook his head, dismissing the thought for now. Speculation was dangerous without evidence. Tomorrow, he would confront the other passengers again, probing deeper into their alibis and motives. The button, the cloak, the letter, they would lead him to the truth. As surely as the Silver Crescent Express would eventually lead its passengers to Vienna. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of rest, his mind still turning over the puzzle like a jeweller examining a flawed gem. The midnight bell had rung, and Hercule Poirot would not rest until he had answered its call. Chapter 9. The Colonel's secret. The Silver Crescent Express remained stalled in the snow, its opulent interiors now tinged with an air of suspicion and dread. The first-class carriage, once a haven of luxury, had transformed into a claustrophobic stage where every passenger was both actor and suspect in a grim drama. Hercule Poirot, with his impeccable grey suit and polished shoes, sat in the dining car, now a makeshift investigation room, his notebook open before him. The faint glow of the carriage's lamps cast long shadows, and the soft clinking of teacups from the nearby galley was the only sound breaking the heavy silence. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in an impenetrable white, isolating the train and its secrets. Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the room, his mustache twitching slightly as he reviewed his notes. The button found in Mrs. Margaret Lyle's compartment, a small brass object with a distinctive regimental insignia, had led him directly to Colonel Henry Warwick. The retired military man, with his stiff posture and clipped speech, had been evasive during their earlier interviews, but Poirot sensed there was more to uncover. The Colonel's connection to the Harcourt scandal, mentioned by Clara Evans, gnawed at Poirot's intuition. A man like Warwick, proud and disciplined, would not lose a button carelessly, nor would he admit to wandering the corridor near a murder scene without good reason. Poirot decided it was time to confront the Colonel directly. He sent Peer, the conductor, to summon Warwick. The young man, still pale from the ordeal of discovering Langston's body, nodded nervously and disappeared down the corridor. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his mind racing through the web of clues. The torn letter with vengeance scrawled upon it, the monogrammed handkerchief with the initial E, the midnight bell, and now this button. Each piece was a thread in a tapestry of deception, and Poirot was determined to unravel it. Colonel Warwick entered the dining car with the measured stride of a man accustomed to command. His face, lined with years of service, was set in a grim mask, his eyes wary but resolute. He wore a dark wool coat, its buttons gleaming save for one missing from the cuff, a detail Poirot had already noted during their first meeting. Warwick sat across from Poirot, folding his hands on the table, his posture rigid. "Monsieur le Colonel," Poirot began, his voice smooth but laced with authority, "we must speak plainly. The button found in Madame Lyle's compartment is yours, is it not?" Warwick's jaw tightened, but he did not flinch. "It may be," he replied, his tone clipped. "I noticed one missing from my coat this morning. Hardly a crime, Monsieur Poirot." "Perhaps not," Poirot said, his eyes narrowing, "but it is curious, Nan. A button from your coat, found in the compartment of an elderly woman who claims she saw a man lurking in her room at the time of Monsieur Langston's murder, and you, Colonel, admit to being in the corridor near Langston's compartment at midnight, searching for this very button. A coincidence, perhaps, but Hercule Poirot does not believe in coincidences." Warwick's fingers twitched, betraying a flicker of unease. "I told you, Poirot, I was in the corridor briefly. I realized my button was missing after dinner and went to look for it. I didn't enter Langston's compartment, nor anyone else's." Poirot leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "And yet, Colonel, you have not explained why you were near Langston's compartment at all. The corridor is long, and your own compartment is at the far end of the carriage. Why search for a button in such a specific place, unless you had reason to be there?" Warwick's eyes darkened, and for a moment Poirot thought he might refuse to answer. But the Colonel exhaled sharply and leaned back, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Very well, Poirot. You're a persistent man, and I suppose there's no avoiding it. I was near Langston's compartment because I was watching him. Poirot's eyebrows rose. "For what purpose, monsieur?" Warwick hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "Langston was a scoundrel, Poirot. You've heard by now, I'm sure, of the Harcourt scandal. A decade ago, Victor Langston's business dealings ruined a good family, my brother's family, to be precise. My brother, Charles Warwick, was a friend of the Harcourts. He invested heavily in one of Langston's ventures, a mining operation in South Africa. Langston falsified reports, inflated profits, and when the scheme collapsed, Charles lost everything. His health declined, and he died within a year. The Harcourts suffered even worse. Lee Harcourt, their daughter, took her own life after the family's ruin. I've carried that knowledge for years. Poirot's expression softened, though his mind remained sharp. And so, you bore a grudge against Monsieur Langston. A motive, perhaps, for murder. Warwick's eyes flashed with indignation. I'm no murderer, Poirot. I despised Langston, yes, but I didn't kill him. I was watching him because I suspected he was up to something on this train. He was nervous at dinner, constantly looking. Over his shoulder, I thought he might be meeting someone, perhaps another victim of his schemes. I wanted to know what he was planning. Poirot tilted his head, studying Warwick's face. The Colonel's story was plausible, but it raised more questions than it answered. And this button, Colonel, how did it end up in Madame Lyle's compartment? I don't know, Warwick said, his voice firm but strained. I noticed it was missing after dinner, as I said. I retraced my steps through the corridor, thinking it might have fallen off while I was walking. I didn't enter anyone's compartment, and I certainly wasn't in Mrs. Lyle's. She's a confused old woman, perhaps. She imagined the man in her room. Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile. Madame Lyle may be elderly, but her mind is sharp. She described a man in a dark coat, and you, monsieur, wear such a coat. The button matches your regimental insignia, and yet you claim innocence. Tell me, Colonel, did you see anyone else in the corridor that night? Warwick hesitated, his eyes flicking to the side. I saw the conductor, Pierre, near Langston's compartment. He was fiddling with his keys, looking agitated, and I thought, I saw a shadow move down the corridor, a figure in a cloak, perhaps, but it was too dark to be sure. Poirot made a note in his book, his pen moving with deliberate precision. A shadow, you say, most interesting. And what time was this, Colonel? Around midnight, perhaps a little after, Warwick replied. I didn't linger. I returned to my compartment soon after. Poirot closed his notebook and leaned back, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. You have given me much to consider, Colonel Warwick, but there are inconsistencies in your story. If you were merely searching for a button, why not ask the conductor for assistance? Why wander the corridor alone, near the very compartment where a man was murdered? And this connection to the Harcourts, it gives you a powerful motive, does it not? Warwick's face reddened, but he kept his voice steady. I've told you the truth, Poirot. I didn't kill Langston. I'm a soldier, not a sneak who stabs a man in his sleep. If you doubt me, find proof. You won't, because there is none. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. Proof, monsieur, is what I seek, and I assure you I will find it. You may go, for now. Warwick rose, his movements stiff, and left the dining car without another word. Poirot sat in silence, his mind turning over the Colonel's words. Warwick's motive was clear, vengeance for his brother's ruin and the Harcourt tragedy, but his denial seemed genuine. Yet the button was a damning clue, and Poirot could not dismiss the possibility that Warwick was lying Gillibrastem. Lying. The Colonel's story had a ring of truth, but the button in Mrs. Lyle's compartment was a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Poirot's mind churned with possibilities. Was Warwick telling the truth about merely searching for a lost button? Or was he hiding a darker purpose? The mention of a cloaked figure and Pierre's nervous behavior added layers to the mystery. Poirot knew he needed to dig deeper into the Harcourt connection and the other passengers' alibis to uncover the full truth. He stood, adjusting his tie, and resolved to speak with Mrs. Lyle again. Her account of the man in her compartment could hold the key to breaking Warwick's story or confirming it, As he stepped into the corridor, the train creaked slightly, a reminder of their isolation in the snowy wilderness. The truth was close, but it would require all of Poirot's brilliance bring it to light. The dining car was empty now, save for the faint echo of Pierre's footsteps in the distance. Poirot returned to his notes, sketching a timeline of the night's events. The button, the letter, the bell, the scream-all were threads in a tapestry that was slowly taking shape. He would confront each passenger again, probing their stories for cracks, and he would not rest until the murderer or murderers were unmasked. As the snow continued to fall outside, Poirot felt the weight of the case pressing upon him. The Silver Crescent Express was a microcosm of secrets, and he was determined to unravel them all before the train could move again. The Colonel's secret was just one piece of the puzzle, but it was a significant one. The next step was to verify his story against the other passengers' accounts and the physical evidence. The truth, Poirot knew, was always hidden in the details. He closed his notebook and stood, his mind already racing toward the next interview. The dining car's lamps flickered slightly, casting shadows that seemed to dance with the secrets of the passengers. Poirot's work was far from over, but he was Hercule Poirot, and no mystery could elude him for long. Chapter 10. The diplomat's disguise, the Silver Crescent Express, remained motionless, a gleaming steel beast ensnared by the snowy claws of the Alps. Its opulent interiors, usually alive with the clinking of glasses and the murmur of refined conversation, were now cloaked in an uneasy silence. Hercule Poirot sat in his compartment, his small, precise hands folded over his walking stick, his grey eyes narrowed in thought. The murder of Victor Langston, stabbed 12 times in a locked compartment, had transformed the train into a microcosm of suspicion, each passenger a potential player in a deadly game. The latest thread in Poirot's investigation led him to the enigmatic Count Vladimir Orloff, whose aloof demeanor and guarded responses had piqued the detective's curiosity from the start. The morning after the murder, the dining car, now doubling as Poirot's investigation room, was bathed in pale light filtering through frost-covered windows. The passengers, summoned for further questioning, sat in uneasy clusters, their faces reflecting a mix of exhaustion and dread. Poirot, impeccably dressed despite the hour, stood at the head of the table, his moustache perfectly symmetrical, his posture radiating calm authority. He had already uncovered fragments of truth: Clara Evans's nervous admissions, Madame Dubois' evasive alibis, Colonel Warwick's dubious corridor encounter, and the tangled motives of Emily Thornton and Julian Blake. Yet the diplomat, Count Orlov, remained an enigma, a puzzle piece that refused to fit. Madame et Messieurs Poirot began, his voice soft yet commanding, "We are, as you know, confined by this snow until help arrives. The murderer of Monsieur Langston is among us, and I, Hercule Poirot, will not rest until the truth is revealed. Today, I wish to speak further with Count Vladimir Orloff, Monsieur le Comte, if you please." The man in question sat at the far end of the table, his angular face framed by neatly combed dark hair, his eyes cool and unreadable. He wore a tailored suit of deep navy, his cufflinks glinting with understated elegance. His title as a diplomat had granted him a certain deference among the passengers, but Poirot's scrutiny was undeterred by rank or reputation. Orlov rose slowly, his movements deliberate, and inclined his head with a faint smile. "Monsieur Poirot," he said in a clipped accent, "I am at your disposal. But I assure you, I have nothing to hide." Poirot's lips twitched in what might have been a smile, though his eyes remained sharp. "We shall see, monsieur. The truth, it is like a fine wine, it requires time to reveal its full character. Let us begin with your purpose on this train. You are a diplomat, we, travelling to Vienna for matters of state." Orlov nodded. "Precisely. My work involves delicate negotiations, which I am not at liberty to discuss. My presence here is merely a matter of transit." "Transit, perhaps," Poirot said, pacing slowly, but not without purpose. "I have observed you, Monsieur le Comte. You are reserved, watchful. You speak little, yet your eyes they miss nothing. Tell me, what was your connection to Victor?" Langston Orlov's expression remained impassive. "I had no connection to him. We exchanged pleasantries at dinner, nothing more. He was a businessman, I a diplomat. Our worlds did not intersect." Poirot paused, tilting his head. "And yet you were seen near his compartment last night, close to the time of the murder. The conductor, Pierre Dubois, reported a figure in the corridor, a man, perhaps moving with purpose. Was that you, monsieur?" A ripple of tension passed through the room. The other passengers shifted, their gazes darting between Poirot and Orlov. The Count's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "I was in my compartment, Monsieur Poirot. The conductor must be mistaken. The corridors of this train are narrow, the lighting dim. A shadow could be anyone." "Perhaps," Poirot conceded, his tone deceptively mild. "But let us consider another matter. Your papers, Monsieur le Comte. May I see them?" Orlov hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his face before he regained his composure. "My papers are in order, but they are private, as is customary for a diplomat. Surely you understand." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "I understand many things, monsieur. I understand that a man who is what he claims to be has no need for secrecy. I understand that a diplomat's papers are his shield, but also his vulnerability. If you will not show them willingly, I must insist." The room grew quieter, the air thick with anticipation. Orlov's fingers tightened briefly on the armrest of his chair before he reached into his coat and produced a slim leather portfolio. "Very well," he said, sliding it across the table. "But you will find nothing amiss." Poirot opened the portfolio with the precision of a surgeon, extracting a set of documents bearing official seals and ornate signatures. He studied them carefully, his brow furrowing slightly. The passengers watched, their curiosity palpable. Clara Evans fidgeted with her glasses, Madame Dubois's painted lips pursed, and Colonel Warwick's moustache twitched as he leaned forward. After a long moment, Poirot closed the portfolio and looked up. "These papers," he said softly, "are a work of art. The seals, the signatures, the texture of the paper, all impeccable. Too impeccable, perhaps. A genuine document, it has flaws, imperfections born of bureaucracy. These, monsieur, are too perfect. They are forged." A collective gasp rose from the table. Orlov's composure faltered, his eyes narrowing. "That is absurd," he said, his voice sharp. "I am Count Vladimir Orlov, accredited by Nan, Monsieur Poirot." Interrupted, raising a hand. "You are not Count Orlov. You are, I suspect, someone else entirely. And I believe you were on this train for a purpose far more personal than diplomacy. You were watching Victor Langston, were you not?" The accusation hung in the air like a storm cloud. Orlov's face darkened, but he said nothing, his silence more telling than any protest. Poirot pressed on, his voice steady but relentless. "Let us imagine, for a moment, A man who is not what he seems. A man hired, perhaps to follow another, to observe his movements, to uncover his secrets. Such a man might travel under a false identity, might he not? Tell me, monsieur, who are you, and who sent you to track Victor Langston? The passengers were now openly staring, their earlier restraint giving way to fascination. Emily Thornton clutched Julian Blake's arm, her eyes wide. Miss Agnes Holt, the quiet governess, sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. But her gaze was fixed on Orloff with an intensity that Poirot noted. Orloff leaned back, crossing his arms. You weave an intriguing story, Monsieur Poirot, but you have no proof. These accusations are baseless. Baseless. Poirot's voice took on a sharper edge. Then let us test your story. You claim you were asleep at the time of the murder, yet the conductor saw a man near Langston's compartment at midnight. You claim no connection to Langston, yet I have learned from Mademoiselle Evans that Langston was a man with many enemies, a man whose past was a web of deceit. A man like you, with forged papers, might have been hired to untangle that web, or perhaps to add a new thread to it. Orlov's eyes flickered, but he maintained his silence. Poirot turned to the conductor, Pierre Dubois, who stood nervously by the door. Monsieur Dubois, you saw a figure in the corridor. Can you confirm it was this man? Pierre hesitated, his fingers twisting the hem of his uniform. I cannot be certain, Monsieur Poirot. It was dark, and the figure wore a cloak. But it could have been him. Poirot nodded, as if expecting this ambiguity. Merci, Monsieur Dubois. Your uncertainty is noted. But let us return to the papers. A man with forged documents is a man with a secret, and secrets on a train with a murdered man are dangerous indeed. The interrogation continued for hours, Poirot circling Orloff like a hawk, probing for weaknesses. He asked about Orloff's movements, his conversations, his reasons for choosing the Silver Crescent Express. Each question was met with a calculated response, but Poirot's persistence began to wear on the so-called Count. Finally, as the afternoon light waned, Orloff's facade cracked. Enough, he snapped, slamming a hand on the table. The passengers flinched, and even Poirot raised an eyebrow. You want the truth? Very well. I am not Count Orloff. My name is Ivan Petrov, and I am a private investigator. I was hired to follow Victor Langston, to gather evidence of his dealings. But I did not kill him. The revelation sent a murmur through the room. Madame Dubois's fan stilled, Colonel Warwick's jaw tightened, and Clara Evans let out a small gasp. Poirot, however, remained unruffled, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. And who, Monsieur Petrov, hired you? He asked. Petrov's eyes darted to the side, a fleeting glance that Poirot caught. That I cannot say. My client values discretion. Discretion, Poirot repeated, his tone laced with irony. A convenient shield for a man in your position. But let us be clear, Monsieur Petrov. You were near Langston's compartment at midnight, were you not? You saw something, or perhaps someone. Petrov hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. I saw Mademoiselle Evans' clarineer his compartment. She was carrying a folder, and she looked agitated. I thought it strange, but I did not interfere. My job was to observe, not to act. Clara's face drained of color. That's a lie, she cried, rising from her seat. I was in my compartment by then. I delivered those documents at 9, as I told you. Poirot raised a hand to silence her. Calm yourself, mademoiselle. We will return to your account. For now, Monsieur Petrov, you have given us much to consider. a private investigator disguised as a diplomat, following a man who is now dead. A man who saw Mademoiselle Evans at a critical moment. The pieces, they begin to form a picture, Nan. The dining car fell silent, the weight of Petrov's confession settling over the group. Poirot's mind was already racing, connecting this new information to the torn letter, the handkerchief, the button, and the tangled motives of the passengers. Ivan Petrov's presence was no coincidence. He was a key to unlocking the truth, but his role was still unclear. Was he a witness, a conspirator, or something else entirely? As the passengers dispersed, Poirot lingered, his gaze fixed on the snowy landscape beyond the window. The Silver Crescent Express was a world unto itself, a stage where each player wore a mask. Ivan Petrov had removed one, but others remained. The Harcourt scandal, the letter fragment with vengeance, the handkerchief with the initial E, all pointed to a deeper conspiracy, one that Poirot was determined to unravel. He returned to his compartment, where he began to sketch a timeline on a small notepad. At 9 p.m., Clara delivered documents to Langston. At 12:30 a.m., Pierre heard the bell from Langston's compartment. At 12:40 a.m., Mrs. Lyle rang her bell, claiming she saw a man. And at midnight, Petrov saw Clara near Langston's door. The times overlapped, the stories conflicted, and the truth lay buried in the inconsistencies. Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at his door. It was Miss Agnes Holt, the governess, her face pale but composed. "Monsieur Poirot," she said softly, "I must speak with you, alone." He gestured for her to enter, his curiosity piqued. Miss Holt had been a shadow in the investigation, her quiet demeanour overlooked amid the louder personalities of Madame Dubois and Colonel Warwick. Yet now her eyes held a determination that suggested she, too, had a secret to share. "I heard what Monsieur Petrov said," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "and I believe I know who hired him." Poirot leaned forward, his grey cells humming with anticipation. The web was tightening, and the truth was closer than ever. But as Miss Holt began to speak, the train gave a sudden lurch, the lights flickering, as the snow outside seemed to close in tighter. The Silver Crescent Express was not yet ready to release its secrets. The investigation continued, each revelation peeling back another layer of deception. Poirot knew that Petrov's admission was only the beginning. The passengers, bound by their shared confinement, were linked by something deeper. Shared motive, a shared past, or perhaps a shared crime. As he listened to Miss Holt's whispered confession, he felt the pieces of the puzzle aligning. The truth emerging from the shadows of the train's luxurious carriages. The chapter unfolded over days, or so it seemed in the timeless limbo of the stranded train. Poirot's interviews with Petrov revealed more about Langston's shady dealings, a trail of betrayed partners, ruined families, and a scandal that had left scars across continents. The Harcourt family, whose daughter Lily had died in the wake of Langston's greed, emerged as a central thread. Petrov admitted he had been hired by an anonymous client, possibly a Harcourt ally, to gather evidence that could ruin Langston once and for all. But the client's identity remained elusive, hidden behind layers of intermediaries. Poirot cross-referenced Petrov's story with the other passengers' accounts. Clara's agitation, Madame Dubois's financial ruin, Colonel Warwick's lost brother Emily's distant connection to the Harcourts. Julian's blackmail pointed to a collective resentment. The handkerchief with the E could belong to Emily or Elise, Madame Dubois, or it could be a deliberate misdirection. The button in Mrs. Lyle's compartment implicated Warwick, but his story of a lost button was plausible, if convenient. And Miss Holt's sudden willingness to speak suggested she, too, had a stake in the truth. The dining car became a battleground of revelations, each passenger's story colliding with the others. Poirot orchestrated these confrontations with the precision of a conductor, drawing out contradictions and half-truths. Petrov's role as an observer, not a participant, held for now. But his presence near Langston's compartment at midnight raised questions. Had he seen more than he admitted? Was his client one of the passengers, or an unseen force orchestrating from afar? As the snow continued to fall, sealing the train in its icy prison, Poirot's mind worked tirelessly. He sketched diagrams, mapped alibis, and traced the threads of motive and opportunity. The 12 stab wounds, some shallow, some deep, suggested a crime of passion, but also calculation. The torn letter, the handkerchief, the buttonhole were clues, but none were definitive. The truth, Poirot knew, lay in the human heart, in the secrets each passenger carried. By the end of the chapter, Poirot was closer to the truth, but not yet there. Petrov's disguise as Count Orlov had been unmasked, but his full role remained unclear. Miss Holt's whispered revelation that she knew the client's identity opened a new avenue. But her words were cut short by the train's lurch, a reminder of their isolation. The passengers, bound by suspicion and guilt, watched Poirot with growing unease, knowing his relentless pursuit of the truth would spare no one. The Silver Crescent Express, stranded in the snow, was a crucible of human nature, and Hercule Poirot was its alchemist. The diplomat's disguise was only one piece of the puzzle, but it was a vital one. As the chapter closed, Poirot sat alone, his notepad filled with notes, his mind alive with possibilities. The truth was near, and he would not rest until it was fully revealed.